long before the glint of imperial eagles or the thunder of legionary boots echoed across the world, there was a land of hills and rivers, a gentle, sun-bathed peninsula extending into the heart of the Mediterranean. It was a land of olives, wild vines, and old stones. Here, on the western edge of the known world, lay Latium, home to shepherds and warriors, merchants and mystics, and in time, the cradle of something far greater than they could imagine. This was not yet Rome. Not quite. Centuries before the word empire had meaning, the people of central Italy lived in small communities, villages scattered across the hills, each clinging to its traditions, gods, and ways. Some were Latin, others Sabine, others still Etruscan, a mysterious people whose language would vanish but whose mark would remain forever. They carved tombs into the rock and worshipped gods in open-air sanctuaries. Their kings ruled city-states with majesty and cruelty. It was a land of rituals, omens, and stories. To the north, the Etruscans flourished, a sophisticated civilization steeped in mystery. They built cities, forged alliances, and traded across the seas. Their ships carried goods and culture, their artists adorned walls with color, and their priests read the future in the flight of birds. To the south, Greek settlers had long since colonized the coast, bringing with them philosophy, temples, and the stories of Olympus. And in the middle, a patch of land with 7 gentle hills beside the Tiber River, a cluster of settlements began to grow closer. The soil was fertile, the river brought trade, and the hills offered protection. Slowly, these villages drew together, not by design, but by necessity. Safety lay in unity. And from that unity came the seed of a city. It is said, and often repeated, that Rome was born of blood, of a mother who was a Vestal virgin and a father said to be Mars himself, the god of war. The twins, Romulus and Remus, were cast into the river by a fearful king, only to be saved by a she-wolf who suckled them beneath the trees. In time, they quarreled. And Romulus, the stronger or perhaps the more ruthless, struck his brother down and claimed the hill for himself. Fact fades into legend here, and yet the Romans would carry this story like a torch through their history, for to them, their city was born not from peace but from conflict, from divine will and fraternal strife. They would see themselves as chosen, set apart by fate, and destined for greatness. By the middle of the 8th century BCE, Rome had taken shape, still small, still fragile, but unmistakably different. It was a monarchy then, ruled by kings whose names still echo in old chronicles. Some were Latin, some Sabine, and at least one, Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, was Etruscan. Under these early rulers, the city grew. They drained marshes, built temples, erected the great Cloaca Maxima, Rome's first major saw. They laid down stones for roads that would one day bind continents together. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. For even in its infancy, Rome bore the seeds of ambition and rebellion. The kings ruled by might and tradition, but the people are fierce, proud, suspicious of tyranny, would not endure such rule forever. Thus begins the story of Rome. Not with triumph, not with marble, but with earth and fire, river and myth. A city of shepherds and warriors, born from legend, shaped by survival. The empire is still far away, its glory yet unseen. But the heartbeat of something eternal has already begun to sound beneath the 7 hills. The Rome of Romulus was still a modest place, more camp than capital, more hope than power. Yet even in its crude beginnings, the city held a kind of promise. With time, the traces of scattered huts gave way to houses of stone, and the settlement on the Palatine Hill became the heart of something that would endure for centuries. Romulus, as legend tells, became the first king. He ruled not only with a sword but also with cunning. When Rome lacked women to continue its bloodline, he staged a festival and invited the neighboring Sabines. During the festivities, his men seized the Sabine women and took them as wives. It was an act of treachery cloaked in necessity, a grim birthright the Romans would remember without shame. The ensuing conflict with the Sabines nearly consumed the young city. But in the end, the women themselves intervened, placing their bodies between their fathers and husbands, and peace was forged. The Romans and Sabines would live as one people thereafter, not the last time that war would be answered by union. Romulus ruled for many years until, as the myth tells, he vanished in a storm and was taken to the heavens by the gods. The Romans, ever fond of meaning, believed he became the god Quirinus, guardian of the state. After Romulus came a line of kings, 7 in all according to tradition. They ruled from around 753 to 509 BCE, each contributing to the shape and spirit of early Rome. Numa Pompilius, the second king, was Sabine, a man of peace and piety. Under his hand, temples were raised, calendars organized, and Rome's religious institutions were established. He was said to converse with the nymph Egeria in sacred groves, drawing wisdom from her counsel. Then came Tullus Hostilius, more warlike than his predecessor. He destroyed Alba Longa, an ancient Latin rival, and incorporated its people into Rome. The boundaries of the city grew not only through conquest but through integration, a pattern that would define Rome again and again. Ancus Marcius followed, blending war and religion, building Rome's first bridge over the Tiber and founding the port of Ostia, a step that opened Rome to the sea and the wider world beyond. And then the kings became Etruscan. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus, of foreign origin but great ambition, seized the throne and brought with him the grandeur of Etruscan culture. Under his rule, the Circus Maximus was begun, a vast arena for chariot races. He fortified the city and expanded the Forum, giving Rome the trappings of a true capital. His successor, Servius Tullius, may have been born a slave, or so the stories claim. But he rose to rule, and his legacy remains written not in myth but in stone. He reorganized the people into classes based on wealth and instituted the census, a quiet revolution that structured the republic to come. He also expanded Rome's walls, encompassing the 7 hills and giving the city its first true identity as a whole. But the last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, would darken the throne with tyranny. He ruled without consent, with force and fear. He silenced the Senate, crushed rivals, and ruled as if Rome were his alone. And it was through him that monarchy in Rome came to its violent end. For his son, Sextus Tarquinius, committed an unspeakable crime, the rape of Lucretia, a noble woman whose virtue was held in high esteem. Her suicide became the spark for revolution. The people, outraged and weary of kings, rose up under Lucius Junius Brutus and drove the Tarquins from the city. No longer would Rome be ruled by one man. Thus the kings fell, and in their place arose a new form of governance, not by a crown, but by council. The monarchy was gone, but its shadow would remain. The Republic was born. With the expulsion of Tarquin the Proud in 509 BCE, a new chapter opened, one not of kings, but of shared rule, of magistrates and assemblies. The Romans, distrustful now of solitary power, chose instead a system built upon rotation, restraint, and rivalry. Thus was born the residential publica, that public thing, the Republic. Power would no longer rest in the hands of one man. Instead, 2 consuls were elected each year, equal in authority, each holding a veto over the other. They were to rule together, as a safeguard against ambition. And beside them stood the Senate, a body of patricians, the old noble families, guardians of tradition and influence. Though unelected, their counsel carried great weight, often more enduring than the consuls themselves. Yet from the start, this new order was incomplete. Rome was now free from kings, but not from inequality. Society was sharply divided between the patricians, the aristocratic elite, and the plebeians, the common people, farmers, artisans, and soldiers who bore the burdens of Rome but shared little in her power. The plebeians had no voice in the Senate, no access to high office, and no protection from laws written and enforced by men of wealth. They could be imprisoned, enslaved for debt, or punished by magistrates with little recourse. And so, beneath the surface of the young republic, tension grew. It was not long before this strain gave way to struggle, not in open rebellion, but in persistent, organized defiance. Around 494 BCE, the plebeians withdrew from the city in protest, retreating to a hill outside Rome in what would be remembered as the First Secession. It was a bold act, for without the common people, Rome could not function, no soldiers, no farmers, no city. The patricians, alarmed by the sudden paralysis, relented. A compromise was struck, the creation of the office of the tribune of the plebs, officials elected by the plebeians, empowered to protect them from injustice. The tribunes had one extraordinary weapon, the power to veto any action of the magistrates or senate they deemed harmful. Their persons were declared sacred, to harm a tribune was sacrilege. This was a beginning, not an end. Over the decades that followed, the plebeians would fight a long and patient battle to open the Republic to all Romans. They would demand, and win, the right to hold office, to marry into patrician families, to have their decisions in the tribal assemblies carry the force of law. Yet this struggle, known as the conflict of the orders, would last more than 2 centuries. It was not marked by revolution, but by pressure, slow, deliberate, persistent. Each step forward was won by unity and courage. And through it all, Rome changed. As the Republic grew more inclusive, it also grew stronger. The blend of patrician prestige and plebeian energy created a society unusually adaptable. Rome began to expand its influence across Latium, forging alliances, founding colonies, and binding new peoples to her rule not just by conquest, but by offering a path to belonging. Even Rome's army reflected this republican spirit. Every citizen owed military service, and every soldier had a voice, however small, in the decisions of the state. The legion, born in these early years, was not just a fighting force, but a reflection of Roman society itself, disciplined, resilient, and built on cooperation. The Republic was young, imperfect, often unjust. But it had survived the fall of kings, endured internal conflict, and begun to shape a model of governance that would echo through the ages. And as the walls of the city grew thicker, as roads stretched outward into the countryside, a quiet truth began to settle: Rome was no longer a city clinging to survival. It was becoming a force that would shape the destiny of others, a power on the rise. In the earliest years of the Republic, law was not what we might understand it to be today. It was not written in books or carved in stone. Rather, it lived in memory, guarded and recited by the patricians, passed from father to son, from magistrate to judge. In this, the law was a tool of power, held by the few, used to bind the many. For the plebeians, this was intolerable. They had wrested from the elite the right to be heard through their tribunes, yet still the rules by which they lived were cloaked in secrecy. How could there be justice when the law was known only to those who wielded it? Their answer was bold: the law must be made visible. In the middle of the 5th century BCE, after growing pressure and protest, the Romans sent envoys to the Greek cities to study their legal systems. Inspired by the clarity of Athenian statutes, Rome resolved to fix its laws, not in memory, but in matter. Thus came the 12 Tables. In 451 BCE, a commission of 10 men, the Decemviri, was appointed to draft Rome's first written code. For a time, they held supreme authority, even replacing the consuls. Over 2 years, they compiled a set of laws that reflected the customs, values, and hard realities of Roman life. These were not lofty ideals, but practical rules: how to handle debts, disputes over land, rights in marriage, and punishments for theft. The laws were etched onto 12 bronze tablets and set up in the Forum for all to see, a public contract between citizen and state. For the plebeians, this was a triumph. No longer would they be judged by hidden standards or the whim of the powerful. The law now stood in the open, fixed and unchanging, as much a part of the city as its stones. Yet the content of the 12 Tables revealed as much about Rome's character as its legal ambition. It was a society fiercely protective of order, hierarchy, and tradition. The laws permitted creditors to enslave debtors, demanded harsh punishment for theft, and held family authority as sacred. One law even prohibited the marriage between patricians and plebeians, a reminder that equality had yet to fully bloom. Still, the 12 Tables became the foundation of Roman jurisprudence. They would be taught to children, quoted by orators, and revered by jurists for centuries. Even in the imperial age, long after the bronze had vanished, their legacy endured as the first breath of Roman law. But law alone did not define the Republic. Alongside its statutes lived mos maiorum, the custom of the ancestors. This unwritten code governed behavior, guided decisions, and gave Roman society its cohesion. Honor, duty, discipline, and reverence for tradition, these were the quiet laws of Roman hearts. Together, the 12 Tables and the mos maiorum formed a dual pillar, one written, one remembered. One for the courtroom, the other for the soul. and through them, the Republic stood firmer. Not unshakable, not just, but steadier. A city not only ruled by men, but by ideas. A society where law began to take root, and through it, a shared Roman identity. By the close of the 5th century BCE, Rome had grown from a quarrelsome city into a regional force, a republic hardened by internal struggle and unified under shared laws. But all around her, the Italian peninsula was a patchwork of peoples: Latins, Sabines, Volsci, Samnites, Etruscans, Greeks, each with their own towns, gods, and ambitions. The land was fertile, the hills defensible, the seas near. It was a place worth holding. And so, Rome began to expand, not in haste, but in a steady, relentless advance. The earliest campaigns were against neighbors. Rome fought the Volsci and Equi, mountain peoples who raided the countryside and tested the Republic's young army. These were not great wars, but they were constant years of marches, ambushes, and stubborn resistance. Victory came not from brilliance but from perseverance. Rome, it seemed, had little taste for surrender. But the real test came with the Samnites. These highland warriors ruled the central Apennines, fierce in battle and proud in independence. Between 343 and 290 BCE, Rome fought 3 bitter wars against them, wars that spanned generations, that bled the countryside and reshaped Roman arms. The First Samnite War was short and inconclusive. But it was the second that truly tested Rome. At Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, the Roman army was trapped in a narrow pass and forced to surrender. The surviving soldiers were humiliated, stripped of arms and made to pass under a yoke of spears. It was a wound to Roman pride, a moment never forgotten. But Rome did not fall. She returned, learned, and reformed. Tactics changed. The legion, ever flexible, proved superior to the rigid phalanxes many Italians used. Roads were built, not just for trade, but for war. And with each victory, Rome extended more than just her reach, she offered terms. Rome's genius was not just martial but diplomatic. She did not simply conquer, she allied. Cities that submitted were not destroyed. Instead, they became soci, allies, bound by treaty to Rome. They retained local autonomy but owed soldiers and loyalty. In return, they shared in the spoils of war, and many would one day gain citizenship. This network of allies, the Italic system, would be Rome's great advantage for centuries. It turned conquered foes into partners and made Rome's wars a shared endeavor. By 290 BCE, the Samnites were broken, and central Italy was firmly in Roman hands. But the south remained, and here a different challenge awaited. The Greek cities of Magna Graecia, wealthy and proud, looked upon Rome with disdain. When Roman armies approached, they called for help from across the sea, to Epirus, to a man named Pyrrhus. Pyrrhus was a descendant of Alexander the Great, a king of ambition and skill. In 280 BCE, he crossed into Italy with war elephants and a professional army, seeking to humble Rome and carve a Western empire. He won early victories, but at terrible cost. At Heraclea, then at Asculum, his forces triumphed, but barely. Another such victory, he is said to have muttered, "And I shall be undone." Hence the phrase, a Pyrrhic victory. Rome, unlike Pyrrhus, could afford such losses. Her allies remained loyal. Her army replenished. And when Pyrrhus finally withdrew, defeated more by Rome's resilience than her swords, the Greek cities of the south surrendered. Rome was now mistress of nearly all Italy. Not yet an empire, but something more than a city. A republic surrounded by allies, fortified by roads, bound by law and loyalty. From this foundation, Rome would rise. She had tested her strength, found her method, and now turned her eyes outward, across the sea, to a dark and rising rival. By the dawn of the 3rd century BCE, Rome had subdued the Italian peninsula. From the Apennine heights to the southern shores, her legions had marched, her laws had spread, and her influence had taken root. Yet peace was not to follow. For across the waters to the southwest, another power held sway, older, richer, and no less ambitious. Carthage. Founded centuries earlier by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, Carthage had grown from a colony into a maritime empire. Its merchants reached from Spain to Sicily, from the African coast to the Isles of the Aegean. It was a city of silver, of purple dyes, of vast estates and mighty ships. And unlike Rome, which fought on land and ruled by alliances, Carthage ruled the sea, through trade, tribute, and a navy unmatched in the Western world. For a time, these two powers coexisted, each growing in their sphere. Treaties were signed. Merchants crossed borders. There was respect, but also unease. Neither yet sought open war. But neither could ignore the other. The spark came from Sicily. This large, fertile island lay between them, a crossroads of cultures, long fought over by Greeks, Carthaginians, and local peoples. In the early 260s BCE, a conflict broke out in the city of Messana, where a band of mercenaries, the Mamertines, had seized control and now feared retribution from the nearby Greek city of Syracuse. They called for aid. Carthage came first, eager to protect her influence on the island. But then the Mamertines, fearing Carthaginian dominance, turned to Rome. It was a bold move, and a dangerous one. For now, both Rome and Carthage had reason to intervene. Neither would back down. In 264 BCE, Rome sent troops to Sicily, her first army to cross the sea. The First Punic War had begun. At first, Rome struggled. Her soldiers were brave and disciplined, but the sea was not their domain. Carthage, with its powerful navy, blockaded ports and harassed Roman supply lines. Rome had to adapt, and quickly. She did so with remarkable speed. Within a few years, Rome had built a fleet from scratch. Shipwrights studied a captured Carthaginian vessel, copied its design, and produced hundreds. Lacking the experience to outmaneuver Carthage at sea, Rome introduced a new device, the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike to latch onto enemy ships. This turned naval battles into infantry skirmishes, Rome's strength. The war dragged on for over 2 decades. Sicily was ravaged, cities changed hands, and both sides suffered immense losses. At Mylae and Ecnomus, the Romans won great victories at sea. At Drepana, they suffered terrible defeat. Yet neither side could claim final triumph. It was endurance, once more, that favored Rome. In 241 BCE, after a crushing naval loss near the Aegates Islands, Carthage sued for peace. She surrendered Sicily, paid heavy indemnities, and withdrew from the island. Rome had won, barely, but decisively. This was Rome's first overseas province, and her first taste of empire beyond Italy. But peace was fleeting. The war had wounded Carthage, but not broken her. In the years that followed, she would rebuild her strength, not in Sicily, but in Iberia, under the leadership of a brilliant general whose name would one day terrify Rome. Hannibal. After the First Punic War, Carthage licked its wounds. She had lost Sicily and much treasure, but her spirit was unbroken. In the west, across the sea from Italy, her generals looked to Iberia, rich in silver, grain, and men. It was there, among the rugged hills of Hispania, that Carthage would rebuild her fortune and raise a new army. At the head of this effort was Hamilcar Barca, a seasoned general and a man of deep hatred for Rome. His son, Hannibal, grew up in these campaigns. It is said that, as a child, Hannibal swore an oath at his father's side that he would never be a friend to Rome. Hannibal was not merely a commander. He was a strategist of rare genius, a leader beloved by his men, and possessed of a will forged by war. When he took command in 221 BCE, he wasted no time. He pushed deeper into Iberia, consolidating Carthaginian control. But in doing so, he drew too close to a Roman ally, the city of Saguntum. Rome issued a warning. Hannibal ignored it. He besieged and captured the city. Rome demanded Carthage hand him over. Carthage refused. And so, in 218 BCE, the Second Punic War began. What followed was unlike anything the Romans had faced before. Rather than wait for war to come to him, Hannibal brought it to Rome, by land, through the unthinkable route of the Alps. With an army of Iberians, Gauls, and war elephants, Hannibal crossed the Pyrenees, then the Rhone, and finally the snowy peaks of the Alps, a march of hardship, courage, and loss. Many died along the way. The elephants, icons of Carthaginian might, suffered terribly. But in the end, Hannibal emerged into northern Italy, to the astonishment and fear of Rome. He did not pause. In 218 BCE, he defeated Roman forces at the river Ticinus, then at the Trebia. A year later, at Lake Trasimene, he crushed another army, catching it in a fog-shrouded ambush, one of the largest and deadliest in Roman history. Panic gripped the Republic. The Senate feared invasion. Fields lay scorched. Allies wavered. Rome had never known such a threat on her own soil. In desperation, Rome appointed a dictator, a temporary office given in times of great danger. Quintus Fabius Maximus took the role, but he would not meet Hannibal in open battle. Instead, he adopted a strategy of delay, shadowing Hannibal, denying him battle, burning crops to starve his army. For this, he earned the name Cunctator, the Delayer. Many scorned him, but he held Rome together in her darkest hour. Yet in 216 BCE, the Senate chose aggression once more. At Cannae, on a wide, open plain in southern Italy, the Roman army, perhaps 80,000 strong, met Hannibal. Confident in their numbers, they attacked head-on. Hannibal allowed them to come. He bent the center of his line backward, drawing the Romans inward, while his cavalry swept behind. The trap closed. The Roman legions were surrounded, crushed from all sides. Tens of thousands died, one of the worst defeats in Rome's long history. And still, Hannibal did not march on Rome. Why? Some say his army was too small, too exhausted. Others claim he awaited reinforcements from Carthage that never came. Instead, he camped in Italy for years, winning battles, seeking allies, trying to unmake the Roman Confederation from within. But Rome, battered, bloodied, grieving, did not yield. She rebuilt. She raised new legions. She tightened her hold on allies and hunted those who defected. And, slowly, she learned. Far away, in Spain and Africa, new Roman generals would rise. And in time, one would carry the war back to Carthage's doorstep. While Hannibal remained in Italy, undefeated yet unsupported, Rome turned her eyes to Iberia, the source of Carthage's wealth and manpower. It was here, in this bitter and restless land, that a Roman army, once shattered by defeat, found new leadership in a young and untested commander, Publius Cornelius Scipio. He was barely 24, son of a fallen general, but bold beyond his years. In 210 BCE, he was granted command of Roman forces in Spain, not by seniority, but by daring. Many doubted him. Yet Scipio possessed not only courage, but vision. His first move stunned friend and foe alike. He launched a sudden assault on New Carthage, Carthage's primary base in Iberia, striking at its heart while the main enemy armies were elsewhere. The attack was swift, ruthless, and successful. The port fell. Scipio treated the population with clemency, earning loyalty instead of resentment. It was a hallmark of his leadership. Over the next few years, Scipio fought and defeated Carthaginian commanders one by one, driving them from Spain. By 206 BCE, Iberia was firmly in Roman hands. Carthage had lost its most vital province. Now Scipio turned his gaze toward Africa. He returned to Rome, seeking approval to carry the war to Carthage itself. Many hesitated, Hannibal still lingered in Italy. But Scipio argued that only by threatening Carthage directly could the war be ended. He was granted command. And so, in 204 BCE, with a seasoned army and allied Numidian cavalry, Scipio sailed to Africa. There, he moved swiftly. He defeated local forces, rallied support, and began to choke the Carthaginian homeland. Carthage, desperate, recalled Hannibal from Italy. After over 15 years on foreign soil, Hannibal returned to defend his city. The final confrontation came at a place called Zama, in 202 BCE. There, the two greatest generals of the age met, Hannibal and Scipio. The armies were matched in number, but not in spirit. Scipio had learned from every Roman defeat, had studied Hannibal's tactics, countered his elephants with layered formations, and inspired his men with clarity and calm. The battle was hard fought. Hannibal's elephants charged, but the Romans let them pass through lanes in their lines. Numidian cavalry under Massinissa, Scipio's ally, turned the Carthaginian flanks. Hand-to-hand combat raged. But slowly, surely, Scipio gained the upper hand. By day's end, Hannibal's army was broken. Carthage sued for peace. Rome dictated harsh terms. Carthage would surrender its navy, pay vast sums, and could wage no war without Rome's permission. Hannibal survived, but his power was gone. He would live as an exile, fleeing Roman wrath, and in the end, take his own life rather than be captured. Scipio returned to Rome a hero. The Senate granted him a new name, Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. The Second Punic War, which had brought Rome to the brink, had now ended in Rome's favor. The Republic stood victorious, more powerful, more confident, and now, without rival in the Western Mediterranean. Yet in triumph, Rome changed. The long war had demanded innovation, permanent armies, vast levies, new taxes. It had brought spoils, slaves, and foreign customs. The Senate held firm, but cracks had begun to appear. Wealth flowed in, but so did inequality. Rome was growing, but in ways not all would welcome. Still, for now, there was peace. But the memory of Carthage lingered. And some Romans, like Cato the Elder, would never forget the old enemy. Even as he ended his speeches on unrelated matters, he would add a final phrase. Carthago delenda estimated. Carthage must be destroyed. With Carthage subdued and Spain secured, Rome now stood as master of the Western Mediterranean. Her fleets roamed the seas, her legions guarded distant frontiers, and her name carried the weight of victory. But across the Ionian Sea, in the lands of old empires and golden temples, new ambition stirred. For Rome had not only defended herself, she had awakened to empire. The East had long been the domain of Hellenistic kings, the fractured heirs of Alexander the Great. After his death, his vast conquests splintered into kingdoms, Macedon in the north, the Seleucids in Asia, the Ptolemies in Egypt. These realms were rich in art and wealth, but also in conflict. And in time, they drew Rome in, first as arbiter, then as enforcer, and finally, as master. The first clash came with Macedon. Philip V, king of Macedon, had allied with Hannibal during the Second Punic War, hoping to strike Rome while she struggled. That alliance had brought little fruit, but Rome remembered. After the war with Carthage ended, Rome turned east, not with conquest in mind, but with caution. Yet caution, when carried by legions, often leads to war. In 200 BCE, Rome declared war on Philip, citing threats to her Greek allies. It was a war fought more with maneuver than with blood, but it ended in 197 at Cynocephaly, where Roman flexibility triumphed over the rigid Macedonian phalanx. Rome imposed terms and proclaimed that Greece was now free from Macedon, but increasingly under Roman influence. That promise of freedom, noble in word, proved complex in practice. The Greeks, long proud and fiercely independent, found that Roman protection came with obligations. The Senate intervened in disputes, stationed garrisons, and demanded loyalty. Some welcomed Roman order, others bristled under its shadow. Then came the Seleucid challenge. Antiochus III, the great king of Asia, sought to restore the power of his house. He entered Greece, claiming to be a liberator. Rome saw a threat. War followed once more. At Magnesia in 190 BCE, Roman forces under Lucius Cornelius Scipio, brother of Africanus, crushed the Seleucids. Antiochus was forced to retreat, surrender territory, and pay vast indemnities. The balance of power in the eastern Mediterranean had shifted. Rome had not formally annexed these lands, not yet. But her will now reigned. Treaties bound kingdoms. Garrisons stood in ports. Her allies looked to the Senate for direction, and her enemies feared her resolve. This expansion brought more than territory. It brought wealth in the form of tribute, art, and slaves. Greek sculpture adorned Roman homes. Greek tutors shaped Roman minds. Roman generals returned from the East not only victorious, but transformed, bringing with them luxury, philosophy, and ideas both admired and feared. Yet beneath the triumphs, concern stirred. Some Romans feared that victory had come at a cost. The old virtues of simplicity and discipline seemed to be fading, replaced by greed, ambition, and foreign habits. The Senate still ruled, but elite families grew rich and powerful, while the poor saw little change. Rome had become a hegemon, not by plan, but by necessity and pride. And as her legion secured peace abroad, the seeds of future discord began to take root at home. The Republic had grown. But whether it could govern its growth, that remained uncertain. Victory had brought Rome to greatness, but not all Romans shared in its rewards. As the Republic expanded, rivers of wealth flowed into the city, spoils of war, tribute from allies, and plundered art from the East. Senators returned from campaigns laden with gold and surrounded by slaves. Temples were adorned, new roads paved, and the Forum bustled with trade and ambition. Rome had become a city of marble and marble hearts. But the cost of empire was not merely counted in coin. The structure of Roman society began to shift. Small farmers, once the backbone of the Republic and its army, found themselves pressed to the margins. While they fought abroad, their lands fell into neglect or debt. Many returned home to find their farms sold, seized, or drowned in taxes. Unable to compete with the vast estates of the elite, they drifted toward the city, seeking work, and often finding none. Meanwhile, the aristocracy, the optimates, grew ever more powerful. They bought up land, often illegally, and created massive latifundia, estates worked not by citizens, but by slaves. These slaves, captured in the thousands from Spain, Greece, Africa, and Asia, became the silent engine of Rome's economy. They worked the fields, staffed the kitchens, taught the children of their masters, and even served as doctors and scribes. Rome had become a slave society. The numbers were staggering. By the 2nd century BCE, it is estimated that Italy was home to over 1 million slaves, a population with no rights, no legal protections, and no voice. Rebellions flared, especially in Sicily, where cruel treatment and mass labor created powder kegs of resentment. Twice, full-scale slave wars erupted, requiring legions to crush them. The divide between rich and poor widened. In the streets of Rome, the urban poor, the capititensi, those counted only by head in the census, lived in crowded, unsanitary tenements. They relied increasingly on grain handouts and were courted by ambitious politicians offering food, games, or promises. The Senate, still the heart of Roman governance, often proved indifferent or hostile to reform. Many senators were themselves great landowners, benefiting from the very system that bred inequality. They feared change, viewing it as a threat to order, tradition, and their own wealth. Yet the murmurs of unrest were growing louder. Some voices called for redistribution of land, for limits on estate size, for the return of Roman soil to Roman citizens. These ideas, once fringe, began to take root among the young and the restless, men who saw the Republic not as it was, but as it had been, and what it might be again. Rome stood at a crossroads. Her armies ruled the Mediterranean. Her name inspired awe and fear. But inside her walls, the bonds that held her together were beginning to fray. A society built on conquest and inequality could not stand still forever. The next great struggles would not come from foreign kings, but from within, led by men born Roman, who would challenge the very fabric of the Republic. In the decades following Rome's triumph over Carthage and her expansion into the Greek world, discontent simmered within the Republic. The plebeians, once empowered by centuries of slow reform, found themselves pushed aside by the relentless march of aristocratic wealth. The small farmer, once the backbone of the Roman army and spirit, had withered. Vast estates, worked by slaves, swallowed the countryside. The city swelled with the landless and hungry. Into this world stepped Tiberius Gracchus. Born into a noble family with deep republican roots, Tiberius had served with distinction in the military. He had seen firsthand the decline of the citizen soldier and the rise of despair among Rome's poor. But he was no demagogue. His concerns were sincere, his manner restrained. What he sought was not upheaval, but restoration, a return to the ideals that had once made Rome strong. In 133 BCE, as a tribune of the plebs, Tiberius proposed a law to redistribute public land, the ager publicus, to poor citizens. It was not radical by precedent, similar laws had existed in earlier centuries. But the times had changed. The elite, who had grown rich from these lands, saw the proposal as an attack on their wealth and authority. Tiberius pressed forward. When the Senate refused to fund the reform, he appealed directly to the people, breaking with tradition. When another tribune tried to block the vote, Tiberius had him deposed, a legal act, but an ominous one. The law passed. A land commission was formed. But the Senate seethed. Fearing that Tiberius aimed at kingship, or at least a breach in the republican order, his enemies struck. When he stood for re-election the following year, violence erupted. A mob of senators, armed with clubs and stones, attacked Tiberius and his supporters. He was killed on the Capitoline Hill, his body thrown into the Tiber. It was the first political bloodshed in Rome in centuries. Yet the cause did not die. 10 years later, in 123 BCE, Tiberius's younger brother, Gaius Gracchus, took up the mantle. Where Tiberius had been measured, Gaius was fiery. A skilled orator, passionate and driven, he proposed a broader vision: land reform, grain subsidies, colonies for the poor, and citizenship for Rome's Italian allies. He sought to shift power away from the Senate, empowering the equestrian class and the popular assemblies. His reforms touched every nerve of Roman politics. For a time, he succeeded. His laws passed. His influence grew. But Gaius, too, faced mounting opposition. The Senate, alarmed by his momentum, used fear and division to isolate him. When tensions flared in 121 BCE, the Senate issued a Senatus Consultum Ultimum, the final decree, granting the consuls the power to defend the Republic by any means. Gaius fled. Surrounded by soldiers, he took his own life on the Aventine Hill. His body, like his brothers, was cast into the Tiber. With their deaths, the Republic crossed a threshold. The Gracchi had not led a revolution, they had tried to prevent one. Their calls for reform had been rooted in tradition, in law, in the dignity of the Roman people. But their fall revealed something new, that violence could silence debate, and that power, once used in fear, would be used again. The age of civil blood had begun. And Rome would never again be quite the same. The century that followed the Gracchi brothers was one of recurring turmoil. Their violent deaths had opened a path from which the Republic could not retreat. The idea that politics might be settled by force had taken root. Amidst this unrest, new leaders emerged, men not shaped by patrician lineage, but by war, charisma, and command over soldiers. Chief among them was Gaius Marius. Born in Arpinum, a town outside the traditional Roman elite, Marius was no aristocrat. He rose through merit and military skill, earning a reputation for discipline, resilience, and a shrewd, unbending will. He embodied the novus homo, the new man, one who gained high office without noble ancestry. In 107 BCE, Marius was elected consul, the first of 7 times he would hold that office, a feat unprecedented in Roman history. His rise coincided with a crisis, a brutal war in North Africa against the Numidian king Jugurtha, a master of evasion and bribery who had eluded Roman commanders for years. Marius took command of the war and, with the help of his talented subordinate, a young and ambitious Lucius Cornelius Sulla, finally brought Jugurtha to Rome in chains. It was a triumph that made Marius a hero. But it was not his victories alone that transformed Rome. It was his army. Faced with the need for more soldiers and a dwindling supply of property-owning citizens eligible for service, Marius did the unthinkable: he recruited the landless poor. This marked a quiet revolution. For centuries, Rome's legions had been citizen militias, farmers who fought in defense of their land and returned home when the war ended. Now, under Marius, soldiers were no longer tied to the land. They were volunteers, often with nothing but hope, men who fought for pay, for spoils, and for the promise of land when their service ended. Their loyalty shifted. No longer bound to the Republic alone, they looked to their general, their commander, protector, and benefactor. This personal allegiance to generals rather than to the state would become a defining, and dangerous, trait of the late Republic. Marius's reforms made Rome's army more flexible, more professional, and capable of campaigning year-round. But they also seeded the rise of military strongmen, men who would use their armies not just against foreign enemies, but against Rome herself. Meanwhile, new threats emerged. From the north came the Cimbri and Teutons, vast tribal migrations of Germanic peoples who crushed Roman armies and threatened Italy itself. In a series of hard-fought battles, Marius defeated them, saving the Republic from invasion. His name became legend. Yet with power came rivalry. Marius, once hailed as Rome's savior, grew embittered and ambitious. Political feuds consumed him. His former subordinate, Sulla, brilliant, aristocratic, and resentful, would become his bitterest enemy. The stage was set for a conflict unlike any Rome had ever seen, a civil war between two Roman generals, each backed by his own army, each convinced that only he could save the state. And so the Republic, born of collective rule and checked power, slid further into a world where might made right, and where soldiers followed not the Senate, but the man who led them to victory. By the early 80s BCE, the Roman Republic stood fractured. The reforms of the Gracchi had opened old wounds. Marius's armies had given rise to personal power. And now, the rivalry between two men, Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, would plunge Rome into civil war. Sulla was of noble birth, a patrician with pale skin, sharp wit, and cold eyes. He had served with Marius in Numidia, had helped capture Jugurtha, and had grown increasingly ambitious. But unlike Marius, who had risen from obscurity, Sulla had the Senate's favor. He believed himself the defender of the Republic, on his terms. The spark came in 88 BCE. A war was looming in the east against King Mithridates of Pontus, a cunning ruler who had massacred thousands of Romans in Asia Minor. The Senate gave Sulla command of the war. But Marius, still powerful in Rome, had the decision overturned by a vote of the people, and claimed the command for himself. Sulla, outraged, did what no Roman had done before: he marched on Rome with his army. The legions, loyal to their general, crossed the sacred boundary, the Pomerium, and entered the city. Resistance collapsed. Marius fled. The Senate, terrified, accepted Sulla's authority. But this was only the beginning. Sulla soon left for the east to fight Mithridates. In his absence, Marius returned, now old and embittered. He joined with Lucius Cornelius Cinna, another powerful leader, and retook the city in a brutal purge. Senators loyal to Sulla were executed. Blood ran through the streets of Rome. Marius died shortly after, in 86 BCE, his final days spent in power, but consumed by vengeance. When Sulla returned from the east in 83 BCE, he brought not only victory, but wrath. His legions once again stormed Rome. Battle raged in the suburbs. When the dust settled, Sulla stood alone, master of the Republic. But he did not claim the consulship. Instead, he revived an ancient and extraordinary office, the dictatorship. Traditionally, the dictatorship had been a temporary post, granted in emergencies, limited to 6 months. Sulla redefined it. He took the title dictator for the reconstitution of the Republic, with no set term. With chilling precision, he enacted proscriptions, lists of enemies marked for death. Their names were posted publicly. Anyone could kill them and claim a reward. Lands were confiscated. Hundreds died, senators, equestrians, even distant associates. Sulla claimed he was restoring order, that by shedding blood now, he was saving Rome for the future. Yet his reforms were deeply conservative. He strengthened the Senate, weakened the tribunes, and sought to restore patrician control. But the republic he left behind was more fragile than ever. In 79 BCE, with shocking calm, Sulla resigned his dictatorship. He retired to his estate, drank heavily, and died the next year, his legacy soaked in both blood and paradox. He had shown that a Roman army could seize the state, that a general could become a tyrant, and that the Senate, once supreme, could be silenced by steel. The Republic still stood. But it no longer breathed the same air. With Sulla gone, the Republic staggered on, wounded, cautious, yet still alive. But peace did not follow. Instead, a generation shaped by civil war stepped forward, eager not to restore the old order, but to master it. Two men, above all, came to dominate this uncertain age: Gnaeus Pompeius, known to history as Pompey the Great, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Pompey was young, handsome, and ruthless. Though never formally one of Sulla's officers, he had raised his own army during the civil war and fought for the dictator's cause. For his loyalty, Sulla called him Magnus, the Great, a title once given to Alexander. Pompey relished it. After Sulla's death, Pompey moved swiftly to establish himself. In 77 BCE, he crushed a rebellion in Spain led by Sertorius, a brilliant commander loyal to the old Marian cause. The campaign was long and brutal, but it made Pompey a household name. Meanwhile, in the heart of Italy, another crisis emerged: the Spartacus slave revolt. In 73 BCE, a Thracian gladiator named Spartacus led an uprising of slaves and gladiators that swept through southern Italy. For 2 years, they evaded Roman armies, defeating one general after another. Panic spread. The Senate turned to Crassus. Crassus, though lacking noble ancestry, commanded wealth on a staggering scale. He had grown rich by buying up burning properties, then rebuilding them, often with political strings attached. Ambitious and coldly calculating, he sought not just riches, but power. He took command against Spartacus and brought brutal discipline to the legions, reviving the old punishment of decimation, in which every 10th man of a failing unit was executed. Slowly, he cornered Spartacus, defeating him in 71 BCE. But before the final battle, Pompey, returning from Spain, intercepted fleeing rebels and claimed credit for ending the war. The rivalry between Crassus and Pompey deepened. Both returned to Rome and demanded consulships. Technically, Pompey was too young and had never held lower offices, but the Senate relented. Fear outweighed custom. The two were elected consuls in 70 BCE, uneasily sharing power. Their joint consulship marked a partial retreat from Sulla's reforms. The powers of the tribunes were restored. Courts once controlled by senators were open to the equestrian class. Rome, it seemed, was trying to balance itself again. Yet beneath the surface, the pattern had not changed. Once again, it was generals, not magistrates, who shaped the republic. Once again, the loyalty of soldiers mattered more than votes. And once again, ambition eclipsed tradition. Pompey and Crassus, uneasy allies, bided their time. Pompey still dreamed of glory in the East. Crassus sought influence in the Forum. And somewhere in the shadows, a younger man was watching them both, a man named Gaius Julius Caesar, who would soon rise to stand among them, and then above them. The stage was almost set. The Republic, though not yet dead, was leaning ever more on men of force than on laws of old. By the late 60s BCE, Rome's reach had extended far across the Mediterranean, but her control was still patchy, her enemies persistent. Pirates roamed the seas, disrupting trade and threatening supply lines. In Asia, old rivals stirred. And amid this uncertainty, Pompey saw his chance. The Senate, desperate to restore order, granted him extraordinary powers. In 67 BCE, with the Lex Gabinia, Pompey was given command over the entire Mediterranean and its coasts, an unprecedented move. Many feared it made him too powerful, yet within months, he swept the seas clean. Pirate strongholds were crushed, trade resumed, and Rome exhaled. But Pompey's ambitions did not end with pirates. In 66 BCE, a new law, the Lex Manilia, gave him command against Mithridates of Pontus, Rome's defiant enemy in the east. Mithridates had risen again after Sulla's earlier campaign, allying with Tigrons of Armenia. He was bold, cunning, and bent on defying Roman dominance in Asia Minor. Pompey pursued him relentlessly. In a dazzling campaign, he defeated Mithridates, subdued Tigrons, and brought Syria under Roman control. He reorganized the East, established new provinces, brokered alliances, and poured wealth into the Roman treasury. He marched further than any Roman general before him, and returned with unmatched prestige. By 62 BCE, Pompey was at the height of his fame. He entered Rome not as a mere general, but as a conqueror, celebrated in a magnificent triumph that stretched for days. He had expanded Rome's empire, filled its coffers, and brought peace to its frontiers. But when he sought land for his veterans and ratification of his eastern settlements, the Senate hesitated. They feared his power. They remembered Sulla. And so, they stalled, delayed, resisted. Pompey, frustrated, looked elsewhere for allies. Meanwhile, another man was rising. Gaius Julius Caesar had returned from his own governorship in Spain. He was charming, brilliant, deeply in debt, and dangerously ambitious. He had the favor of the people, the backing of Crassus's money, and the foresight to see what others did not, that the Republic was no longer governed by tradition, but by force and alliance. In 60 BCE, Caesar brokered a pact between the three great powers of Rome, it himself, Pompey, and Crassus. Historians would later call it the First Triumvirate. It was not a legal body. It had no official form. But it controlled Rome. Caesar would stand for consul. Crassus would support him with wealth. Pompey would secure his interests in the east. Together, they would override the Senate, bypass resistance, and rule as a silent coalition. And so, a new chapter opened, not yet dictatorship, not yet empire, but the steady erosion of the republic's core. The consulship, once a prize of civic service, had become a tool of personal power. The Senate, once sovereign, was now an obstacle to be managed. Pompey stood at the peak of his achievements, yet his power was already being eclipsed. For Caesar, younger, bolder, and more ruthless, was only just beginning. In 59 BCE, Gaius Julius Caesar assumed the consulship, the highest office in the Roman Republic. He had reached it with the backing of Pompey and Crassus, the two most powerful men in Rome. But unlike others before him, Caesar would not use the office to serve the Senate's will. He would use it to reshape power itself. His co-consul that year was Marcus Calpurnius Bibulus, a staunch conservative and supporter of the Senate's authority. But Bibulus quickly found himself sidelined, even mocked. Caesar moved swiftly and ruthlessly, pushing through a series of popular laws, redistributing land to veterans, validating Pompey's eastern settlements, and delivering reforms that favored the populace, the people's faction. When Bibulus tried to oppose him, Caesar's supporters showered him with insults and filth in the forum. Humiliated, Bibulus withdrew from public life for the remainder of the year, claiming he was watching the skies for omens. Caesar ruled Rome alone. It was a remarkable demonstration of control and a warning. The consulship, once a shared and balanced office, had become a platform for domination. Yet Caesar's true ambition lay beyond the city. At the close of his term, he secured proconsular command over Cisalpine Gaul, northern Italy, Illyricum, the Balkans, and, by special decree, Transalpine Gaul, southern France. It was an unusual arrangement, 5 years of command over vast and restive territories. And with it came legions. Caesar now had an army. What followed was a campaign of astonishing scope and brutality, the Gallic Wars. For nearly a decade, Caesar would fight across what is now France, Belgium, and even Britain. He would battle Celtic tribes, Germanic chieftains, and one great leader above all, Vercingetorix, a nobleman of the Arverni who sought to unite Gaul against Rome. Caesar's victories were many, but hard-won. He built bridges across the Rhine, crossed into Britain, besieged hill forts, and crushed uprisings. He wrote detailed commentaries on the wars, De Bello Gallico, casting himself as a calm, rational commander acting for Rome's good. But beneath the prose was ruthless ambition. Entire tribes were exterminated. Cities were razed. Tens of thousands were enslaved. Gaul became a testing ground, not only for Roman arms, but for Caesar's political future. With each campaign, Caesar's power grew. He enriched his legions with spoils, secured their undying loyalty, and sent back wealth and glory to Rome. But his growing strength stirred envy, especially in the Senate and in Pompey. The triumvirate, once solid, began to fray. Crassus, eager for his own share of glory, departed for Parthia, where he would meet his end at Carrhae in 53 BCE, his army destroyed, his head used as a stage prop in a foreign court. With his death, the balance shifted. Pompey, now aligned with the Senate, began to distance himself from Caesar. The old allies were drifting toward confrontation. And Caesar, deep in Gaul, understood the peril. He could not return to Rome as a private citizen, for then his enemies could prosecute him, strip him of office, and end his career. He would return only with power. The Republic, stretched and wounded, now faced a question it could no longer avoid. Could two masters exist within a single state? It was the winter of 49 BCE. Julius Caesar stood at the banks of the Rubicon River, a narrow stream in northern Italy, small in breadth but immense in consequence. For this river marked the boundary of his province. To cross it at the head of an army was to declare war on the Roman state itself. Behind him, Gaul lay conquered. Before him, uncertainty. The Senate, now firmly under Pompey's influence, had demanded that Caesar disband his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. They offered no guarantees, only threats, and the near certainty of prosecution and disgrace. Caesar hesitated. But he knew that to yield was to vanish. And so, he crossed. According to tradition, he uttered the words, "Alia iacta ist," the die is cast. With that step, the Republic entered civil war. Caesar moved swiftly. His legions, seasoned and loyal, advanced south. Towns opened their gates. Many senators, including Pompey, fled the city, retreating to the east where they could raise forces. Rome, for a moment, lay empty. But Caesar did not linger. He pursued. His strategy was bold and relentless, a rapid advance that gave the enemy little time to regroup. He moved through Italy, then into Spain, defeating Pompeian forces at Ilerda. In Greece, he clashed with Pompey directly. At first, he met resistance. At Dyrrhachium, he suffered setbacks. But he regrouped, adapted, as he always did. Then came Pharsalus. In 48 BCE, on the plains of Thessaly, the two great Roman commanders met at last in pitched battle. Pompey had more men, more cavalry, and the advantage of position. But Caesar had experience, discipline, and a calm, intuitive grasp of the battlefield. The fight was fierce. Caesar's forces, though outnumbered, held firm. At a crucial moment, he sent a hidden reserve of infantry to flank Pompey's cavalry, throwing them into disarray. The line broke. Panic spread. Pompey fled. Pharsalus was not just a military victory, it was a political earthquake. The Senate's champion had fallen. The last great army of the Republic, loyal to the old order, was shattered. Pompey fled to Egypt, seeking refuge. But there, he was betrayed. Fearing Caesar's wrath, the advisors of the young pharaoh Ptolemy XIII had Pompey murdered upon his arrival. His head was presented to Caesar as a gift. But Caesar did not rejoice. When he saw the severed head of his former son-in-law and rival, he wept. It was not just the death of a man, but of an age. In Egypt, Caesar would become entangled in the dynastic struggle between Ptolemy and his sister, Cleopatra, a woman of wit, charm, and ambition. But that story, rich in drama, lay just ahead. For now, the Republic stood broken. The Senate still existed, but its power was spent. Its armies were scattered. Its authority hollow. And Caesar, commander, politician, reformer, now unchallenged, would soon return to Rome. Not as a consul among equals, but as dictator. After the crushing victory at Pharsalus and the death of Pompey, Caesar sailed to Egypt in pursuit, not of vengeance, but of clarity. What he found was a kingdom in turmoil, as ancient and decadent as Rome was restless and rising. Egypt, though technically independent, was entwined in Roman affairs. The Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty ruling over a native Egyptian population, had long relied on Roman favor to secure their fragile throne. But now that favor was split between siblings at war, the boy king Ptolemy XIII, and his sister and co-ruler, Cleopatra VII. Cleopatra had been driven into exile, but she was not defeated. Intelligent, multilingual, and politically astute, she understood that Caesar held the key to survival. And so, in a daring gesture, she had herself smuggled into the royal palace, legend says wrapped in a carpet, to plead her case before the Roman general. Caesar, weary of politics and intrigue, found her presence compelling. What followed was not merely seduction, but alliance. Cleopatra offered Caesar more than charm. She offered stability in the East, wealth for the Republic, and an enduring link to the legacy of Alexander. For Caesar, her cause became Rome's interest. War soon followed. Ptolemy's advisors, enraged by Caesar's support for Cleopatra, besieged the palace. In the bitter fighting that followed, known as the Alexandrine War, Caesar held firm. He called for reinforcements from Roman Syria. The Nile ran red with battle. At last, Ptolemy XIII was killed, drowning in the river as he fled. Cleopatra was restored as queen, now ruling beside her younger brother Ptolemy XIV, a formality that hid her true power. Caesar remained in Egypt for months. He and Cleopatra became lovers. In 47 BCE, she bore him a son, Caesarion, Little Caesar. Whether Caesar fully recognized the boy as his heir is debated, but Cleopatra saw him as the symbol of a new royal lineage, one that might one day unite the crowns of Rome and Egypt. But Caesar could not stay. Rome called, and crises mounted. In the east, a rebellion stirred in Asia Minor. Caesar moved quickly, defeating the forces of Pharnaces II, son of Mithridates, at the swift and decisive Battle of Zala. It was here that Caesar is said to have penned the famous words, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. He returned to Rome that same year, now at the height of his power. He was named dictator once more, first for a year, then for 10 years. Soon after, he would be appointed dictator for life. Yet Caesar, for all his titles, never claimed the name of king. He understood Rome's hatred of monarchy, rooted in the ancient memory of Tarquin the Proud. But his actions, the concentration of power, the dismissal of old republican checks, stirred unease. To some, he was a savior. To others, a tyrant. He reformed the calendar, founding what we now call the Julian calendar. He restructured debts, appointed magistrates, and extended citizenship. He planned great public works, colonized distant provinces with Roman veterans, and sought to heal the wounds of war. But beneath the surface, resentment brewed. The Republic had fallen in all but name. And in the shadows of the Senate, daggers were being drawn. In the early spring of 44 BCE, Julius Caesar stood atop the world. He had been named Dictator Perpetuo, dictator for life. His face appeared on coins. His statue stood among the gods. His will shaped law, life, and empire. He had brought peace to a war-torn republic, fed its poor, planned libraries, reformed the calendar, and envisioned great campaigns in the East. But with each honor, with each title, a question grew louder: had Caesar become what Rome had once sworn to destroy? Rome's history was rooted in the hatred of kings. From the earliest days of the Republic, the memory of Tarquin the Proud had haunted its politics. Power, unchecked, was feared above all. And now, as senators knelt before Caesar, as his chariot rolled through triumph after triumph, many asked, had Rome once more crowned a king, even if he wore no crown? The final offense came during the festival of Lupercalia. As Caesar sat before the crowd in his gilded robes, Mark Antony approached him with a diadem, the symbol of monarchy. Twice he offered it. Twice Caesar refused. But the crowd watched in silence, and the Senate watched with fear. The gesture, whether staged or sincere, stirred a storm. A conspiracy took root. It grew not among the fringe, but at the heart of Rome, within the Senate itself. Among the conspirators were respected men: Gaius Cassius Longinus, Decimus Brutus, and Marcus Junius Brutus, a man whom Caesar had favored, whose family name evoked the ancient founder of the Republic. Brutus, torn between gratitude and conviction, joined the plot. The plan was simple: kill Caesar before he could become something more. The date was set, the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month. On that morning, omens abounded. A soothsayer warned Caesar to beware the Ides. His wife, Calpurnia, had troubled dreams. The priests reported unfavorable sacrifices. Caesar hesitated, briefly. But one of the conspirators, Decimus, persuaded him to attend the Senate as planned. He arrived at the theatre of Pompey, the temporary meeting place of the Senate. There, in a semicircle of marble, beneath a statue of Pompey, the conspirators closed in. At first, they surrounded him with flattery. Then the first blade struck. Others followed. Caesar tried to resist, but the attack was sudden, overwhelming. He fell, stabbed 23 times. According to legend, when he saw Brutus among them, he uttered the words, "Et tu, Brute." "You too, Brutus." Then he fell, not as a king, but as a mortal. The senators fled. Chaos gripped the city. Caesar's body lay abandoned, blood pooling beneath Pompey's statue, a bitter irony. The man who had defeated Rome's enemies, who had been named Father of the Fatherland, now lay dead by the hands of his peers. But his death did not restore the Republic. Instead, it plunged Rome into deeper crisis. For Caesar's legacy, his reforms, his popularity, his name, would not die with him. The conspirators had struck down the man, but not the movement. The people mourned him. His veterans waited. And in the wings, two men prepared to step into the vacuum: Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal lieutenant, and Gaius Octavius, Caesar's heir. Julius Caesar was dead, but his shadow loomed larger than ever. In the days after his assassination, the conspirators, men who called themselves liberatores, hoped to restore the Republic. They addressed the Senate, claiming they had saved Rome from tyranny. But the people did not rejoice. They wept. They rioted. The man they had loved, who had fed them, led them, honored them, had been struck down in daylight. Mark Antony, Caesar's co-consul and closest ally, took the lead. At Caesar's funeral, he delivered a speech that shook the city. Holding aloft the dictator's blood-stained toga, he read aloud Caesar's will, in which Caesar had left gifts for the Roman people and lands for his veterans. The crowd turned against the assassins. In the chaos, few noticed another name in the will: Gaius Octavius. Octavius was Caesar's great-nephew, just 18 years old, studying in Illyricum when the news reached him. But Caesar had named him as adopted son and heir. With that act, Octavius became not just a youth of noble birth, but Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, and the future of the Caesarian cause. Octavian returned to Italy quietly. The Senate underestimated him. Antony ignored him. But Octavian moved with precision. He rallied Caesar's veterans, gained the support of the populace, and courted the Senate. His youth was his mask. Behind it lay a will as cold and calculating as any Rome had known. Soon, the lines of allegiance became clear. Antony held Caesar's legacy in the forum, Octavian held it in name. Conflict between them grew. In 43 BCE, Octavian marched on Rome. The Senate, seeking a counter to Antony's rising power, legitimized him and granted him imperium. Together with the consuls Hirtius and Pansa, Octavian fought Antony at the Battle of Mutina. The consuls died, Antony withdrew, and Octavian stood alone, the new master of the moment. The Senate hoped to control him. Octavian had other plans. He marched on Rome again, not in defiance, but to demand what he believed was his due. He was elected consul at age 19. Then, he turned to his former rival, Antony, and to another power-hungry figure, Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, Caesar's old ally. Together, they formed the Second Triumvirate, a legally sanctioned alliance with powers greater than any held before. They could make laws without Senate approval, appoint magistrates, and command armies. Their stated goal: to avenge Caesar and restore order. Their first act was not governance, but vengeance. The triumvirs issued prescriptions, lists of enemies marked for death. These were not merely political. They were personal. Wealthy citizens were executed. Property was seized. Old scores were settled. Among the victims was Cicero, the great orator and staunch republican, who had denounced Antony with passion and wit. His death symbolized the end of free speech in Rome. In 42 BCE, at the Battle of Philippi in Macedonia, the triumvirs met the forces of the assassins, Brutus and Cassius. The battles were fierce. Cassius fell upon his sword, believing Brutus defeated. Brutus fought on, then also chose death. The liberators were gone. Rome no longer belonged to the Senate. It belonged to 3 men. But power shared is power challenged. And beneath the veneer of unity, tension brewed. Lepidus was the weakest and would soon be sidelined. Antony and Octavian, one bold, experienced, and indulgent, the other young, calculating, and patient, would drift inexorably toward confrontation. And in the East, Cleopatra, once Caesar's ally, now became Antony's queen. The fate of Rome would soon be decided not in the Forum, but in a battle for the world. After the victory at Philippi, the Roman world stood divided. The West, Rome, Italy, Gaul, and Spain, fell under the control of Octavian. The East, Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt, came under Mark Antony. The Mediterranean, once a Roman lake, now served as a quiet line between 2 rising powers. Mark Antony, a seasoned general and charismatic leader, traveled east to settle affairs and organize the provinces. But in doing so, he also re-entered the world of Cleopatra. Their paths had crossed before, during Caesar's time in Egypt. But now, with Antony's authority and Cleopatra's throne both unchallenged in their spheres, the 2 found common cause. And more than that, they found each other. Cleopatra was no ordinary monarch. She was the last of the Ptolemies, a Greek dynasty ruling over Egypt's vast wealth and ancient mystique. She spoke several languages, understood diplomacy intimately, and presented herself as the living goddess Isis. With Antony, she found not only a partner in power, but a lover who would stand against Rome on her behalf. Their union was not merely personal, it was deeply political. Antony needed Egypt's resources, its gold, and its ships. Cleopatra, in turn, sought protection and prestige. Together, they ruled much of the eastern Mediterranean, establishing themselves in Alexandria as a new axis of power. In Rome, Octavian watched with growing concern and growing opportunity. Antony had left his wife, Fulvia, in Italy. When she died and a subsequent marriage to Octavian's sister Octavia broke down, the breach widened. Antony's distance from Rome became a liability. And Octavian, ever the master of public image, began to paint a portrait for the Roman people. Antony had gone native. He was no longer Roman, Octavian claimed. He was a puppet of a foreign queen, a traitor preparing to divide the empire, to raise Caesarion, the son of Caesar and Cleopatra, as a rival to Rome. In 34 BCE, Antony's actions gave Octavian the pretext he needed. At the donations of Alexandria, Antony publicly distributed territories to Cleopatra and her children. He named Caesarion King of Kings, Cleopatra Queen of Kings. To Romans, it was an affront, the suggestion that a new dynasty might rise in the East, rivaling the Senate's authority. Octavian acted. He obtained Antony's will, or what he claimed was his will, and read it aloud in the Senate. It confirmed the worst fears of the conservatives. Antony wished to be buried in Egypt beside Cleopatra, not in Rome. The shock rippled through the city. In 32 BCE, war was declared, not on Antony directly, but on Cleopatra. Octavian framed it not as civil war, but as a conflict to save Rome from a foreign queen. Behind that claim stood a massive mobilization. Both sides gathered fleets and armies. The fate of Rome, once more, would be decided by steel. And so, the world turned toward the sea. In 31 BCE, the opposing forces met near Actium, on the western coast of Greece. It would be a battle not only of ships, but of legacies. Caesar's heir against Caesar's general. Rome against the East. Octavian against the lovers who dared to rival him. It was the year 31 BCE. Off the western coast of Greece, near a narrow promontory called Actium, two great fleets faced one another in tense silence. On one side stood Gaius Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, now the unchallenged master of the West. On the other, Mark Antony and Cleopatra, veteran of civil war and Queen of Egypt, rulers of the East. It was a war wrapped in propaganda and pride. Octavian had framed the conflict not as a civil war, but as a crusade to preserve Rome's dignity from Eastern decadence. Antony, he said, had fallen under Cleopatra's spell, seduced not only in body, but in soul. The Senate, now purged and obedient, named Octavian commander of all Roman forces. Antony's fleet was larger, built for strength and dominance. But Octavian's was more agile, commanded by the brilliant Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, a general of sharp mind and calm nerve. Months before the battle, Agrippa had seized key positions along the Greek coast, cutting off Antony's supply lines. Inside Antony's camp, doubt and disease spread. His army, camped in marshy ground, suffered from hunger and sickness. His ships, trapped in harbor, could not break free. Time, and the gods, seemed to favor Octavian. At last, on September 2nd, the fleets engaged. It was not a battle of thunder and heroism, but of patience, maneuver, and fire. Octavian's smaller, faster ships harassed the larger vessels of Antony. As the fighting dragged on, a gap opened in the lines, and through it, Cleopatra's fleet slipped away, retreating south. Antony, seeing her departure, broke away and followed. The soldiers, left behind, fought on bravely, but leaderless, they surrendered days later. The battle was lost. But more than that, the cause was lost. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. There, the last echoes of resistance faded. Desertion spread. Allies made peace with Octavian. Hope ebbed away. In 30 BCE, Octavian marched into Egypt. Rather than face humiliation, Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, days later, followed, whether by poison, dagger, or the bite of an asp, none can say for certain. Legend holds she died in her royal robes, beside Antony's tomb, proud even in her fall. With their deaths, the Ptolemaic dynasty ended. Egypt was annexed, its wealth flowing into Roman coffers. Octavian, barely 33, now stood alone. No rival remained. The Republic, fractured by a century of civil strife, had found its conclusion, not in reform, but in conquest. The Senate still met. Consuls were still elected. But all knew now that the real power lay elsewhere, in the hands of one man, backed by legions, sanctified by victory. Octavian would not declare himself king. He was wiser than that. Instead, he would return to Rome and speak softly of peace, of restoration, of shared rule. He would offer the Senate its dignity, while keeping its power in his hands. And in return, Rome would give him a new name. In 29 BCE, Octavian returned to Rome not as a conqueror, but as a restorer. He entered the city in triumph, leading a procession of victory not just over Egypt, but over civil war itself. Rome rejoiced, not for the Senate, nor the Republic, but for the man who had ended decades of chaos. Yet Octavian was careful. He spoke of peace, of tradition, of the Senate's wisdom. He disbanded armies, declined titles that reeked of monarchy, and offered to surrender his powers back to the state. But the Senate, grateful and pliant, begged him to remain. And so, in 27 BCE, a new order was born, with old names. Octavian became Augustus, the revered one. It was not a throne, nor a crown, but a symbol of sanctity, of destiny. He retained the title princeps, first citizen, a term suggesting equality, not rule. But in truth, Augustus held the keys to all power, command of the legions, control over the provinces, influence over law, religion, and coin. This was the Principate, an empire in all but name. Under Augustus, Rome transformed. He reorganized the army, creating a professional force loyal to the emperor, with veterans settled in colonies across the empire. He established the Praetorian Guard, an elite unit stationed in Italy, tasked with protecting the emperor, and, in time, shaping succession. He reformed the tax system, rebuilt the city, and patronized the arts. "I found Rome a city of brick," he would later boast, "and left it a city of marble." Temples were restored, aqueducts repaired, and public games held in dazzling abundance. The Roman Forum, once a place of factional strife, now gleamed with order and purpose. Yet Augustus ruled not only with stone and silver, but with narrative. He commissioned poets like Virgil to craft a noble myth of Rome's founding, tracing its destiny from Aeneas, the Trojan hero, to himself. The Aeneid became more than literature, it was ideology, tying Augustus's rise to the will of the gods. He also elevated morality as a public cause, promoting marriage, penalizing adultery, and encouraging childbirth among citizens. Yet these laws, noble in aim, were hard to enforce, and even Augustus's own family would struggle to live by them. Perhaps his most delicate task was succession. He had no sons, only a daughter, Julia. He adopted several heirs in turn, first Marcellus, who died young, then Agrippa, his loyal general, who also passed, and finally his grandsons Gaius and Lucius, both of whom perished prematurely. In the end, it was Tiberius, his stepson, a capable but doomed man, who would be named heir. Augustus ruled for over 40 years. His reign brought Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a golden age of stability, trade, and expansion. Roads connected the empire. The seas were safe. From Britannia to Arabia, Rome's name inspired awe. But it was peace through power. Peace through empire. When Augustus died in 14 CE, he was mourned not as a man, but as a god. The Senate deified him. His name became sacred. And the Republic, long dormant, faded fully into memory. The empire had begun. When Augustus died in 14 CE, the empire passed not to a council, nor to the Senate, but to a man, Tiberius, his stepson and adopted heir. The transition was peaceful, but uneasy. Rome, for the first time, faced the truth of what it had become, a monarchy cloaked in republican garb. Tiberius was a capable general, stern and secretive. He had served the empire well in campaigns along the Rhine and Danube. But he lacked the charm and vision of Augustus. He neither sought love from the people nor courted favor from the Senate. He ruled by distance and control, often from the Isle of Capri in his later years. His early reign was competent. The empire remained stable. Finances were well managed. But over time, suspicion hardened into repression. Tiberius relied increasingly on the Praetorian Guard and its powerful commander, Sejanus. Under Sejanus's influence, trials for treason became common. A culture of fear crept into the Senate. Accusation replaced debate. Friends betrayed friends. And Tiberius, whether by design or neglect, allowed it to grow. Eventually, even Sejanus fell. In 31 CE, the emperor had him arrested and executed, a reminder that under imperial rule, no one was ever truly secure. Tiberius died in 37 CE, likely by smothering, though some claimed it was natural. The Senate, weary of his rule, welcomed his successor with open arms. That successor was Gaius, known to history as Caligula. Caligula was the great-grandson of Augustus, the son of the beloved general Germanicus. As a child, he had lived among soldiers, earning the nickname of Caligula, Little Boots. His accession brought joy. Rome hoped for a golden heir. At first, he delivered. Public games, tax relief, generous donations to the people, he moved with the exuberance of youth. But then, something changed. Perhaps it was illness. Perhaps it was power itself. But Caligula's reign turned quickly from celebration to horror. He began to speak of himself as a living god. He mocked the Senate, humiliated nobles, and indulged in erratic cruelty. He is said to have appointed his horse, Incitatus, as a priest, and nearly made him a consul. Whether this tale is literal or satirical, it reveals how deeply Rome feared madness in a monarch. Caligula's reign lasted only 4 years. In 41 CE, members of the Praetorian Guard assassinated him in a palace corridor. His wife and daughter were killed. The Senate, stunned, debated restoring the Republic. But the Guard acted swiftly. They found Caligula's uncle, Claudius, hiding behind a curtain, and declared him emperor. Claudius, thought to be weak due to his stammer and limp, surprised many. He proved a diligent and thoughtful ruler. He expanded the empire into Britain, improved administration, and granted citizenship to many provincial elites. His reign was marked by bureaucracy rather than spectacle. Yet his personal life remained turbulent. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, would come to dominate his later years, ensuring that her son by a previous marriage, Nero, would succeed him. In 54 CE, Claudius died, likely poisoned. Once again, Rome whispered and watched as another young man took the purple. That man was Nero. And with him, the Julio-Claudian dynasty would burn toward its end. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus ascended to the throne in 54 CE at just 16 years old. He was the last of the Julio-Claudian line, a dynasty that had ruled Rome since the days of Augustus. His early reign, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the capable Brutus, was marked by moderation, public works, and artistic patronage. But power in Rome rarely allowed innocence to last. As Nero grew into his rule, he grew restless. The death of his mother, Agrippina, once his fiercest protector, signaled a shift. At first, he merely distanced himself. Later, he had her killed. Ancient sources claim she was stabbed in her villa after surviving a staged shipwreck. The act shocked even a city hardened by blood. With Agrippina gone, Nero ruled unfettered. He immersed himself in music, poetry, and performance. He fancied himself a divine artist, singing on stage and playing the lyre to adoring and terrified audiences. For a Roman emperor to perform publicly was scandalous. The Senate watched with growing dismay. Then, in 64 CE, disaster struck. A fire broke out in the shops of the Circus Maximus. It raged for 9 days, consuming much of the city. Narrow streets and wooden structures fed the flames. Panic spread. When it finally ended, 10 of Rome's 14 districts lay in ashes. Rumors swirled that Nero had started the fire himself to clear space for a grand palace, the Domus Aurea, Golden House. Nero denied it. He claimed he had not been in the city. He blamed the Christians, a small, obscure sect viewed with suspicion by many Romans. Thus began the first major persecution of Christians in the empire. Arrested believers were tortured, crucified, and burned as torches in Nero's gardens. It was terror in the name of spectacle. Meanwhile, Nero rebuilt. His new palace sprawled across hills and lakes, adorned with gold, statues, and artificial marvels. He raised taxes to fund it, drawing resentment across the provinces. Plots followed. In 65 CE, the Pisonian Conspiracy, a coordinated effort by senators, poets, and soldiers, aimed to overthrow Nero. It failed. The aftermath brought a wave of executions, including that of Seneca, Nero's old tutor. The emperor's paranoia grew. The Senate cowered. Nero toured Greece, competing in games and theatrical contests. He returned crowned with laurels, all awarded, of course, by judges too fearful to deny him. But in Rome, the mood had shifted. By 68 CE, revolts erupted in Gaul and Hispania. The governor of Hispania, Servius Sulpicius Galba, declared himself emperor. The Senate, sensing the winds, abandoned Nero. Alone and hunted, Nero fled the city. With assassins closing in, he took his own life, reportedly uttering the words, "Qualis artifex perio, what an artist dies in me." He was 30 years old. With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty ended. Rome stood without an emperor, uncertain, exposed, and bracing for what came next. When Nero died in 68 CE, there was no clear heir, no dynasty to guide the Senate, no princeps to command the legions. The Republic was long gone, but the empire stood headless, and in the power vacuum, the provinces moved first. In Hispania, Governor Servius Sulpicius Galba had already declared himself emperor, claiming the mantle as a restorer of order. The Senate confirmed him, hoping for stability. But Galba, old and austere, brought little comfort. He marched into Rome not as a savior, but as a punisher. He refused to pay the Praetorian Guard the donatives Nero had promised them. He executed rivals and dismissed allies. In trying to restore discipline, he earned fear, but not loyalty. Among those he alienated was Marcus Salvius Otho, a former ally passed over for succession. Otho moved quickly. In January 69 CE, with the help of the Praetorians, he had Galba assassinated in the Forum, his severed head paraded on a pike. Otho became emperor. But his rule was challenged before it had even begun. In the north, the legions of the Rhine had declared their own emperor, Aulus Vitellius, a plodding but popular commander. The soldiers marched toward Italy. Otho tried diplomacy, then war. In April, the two sides met at the Battle of Bedriacum in northern Italy. Otho's forces were defeated. Refusing to plunge the empire deeper into civil war, Otho took his own life. He was 37 years old, a ruler for just 3 months. Vitellius now entered Rome in triumph, the third emperor in as many months. He was hailed by his troops, feasted lavishly, and buried the memory of his rivals. But while he indulged in revelry, new trouble rose in the east. In Syria and Judea, the legions had declared another man emperor, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, Vespasian. A seasoned general, Vespasian had been campaigning in Judea when word of Rome's turmoil reached him. Backed by the eastern legions and Egypt, Rome's grain supply, he advanced slowly but surely. Meanwhile, Vitellius's rule unraveled. His extravagance, brutality, and dependence on corrupt favorites soured public opinion. As Vespasian's forces approached, Rome descended into chaos. Fighting erupted in the streets. Temples were desecrated. The capital burned. On December 20, 69 CE, Vitellius was dragged from hiding and executed, his body thrown into the Tiber. He had reigned for 8 months. At last, after a year of fire and blood, Vespasian entered Rome. He did not come as a noble, but as a soldier. A man of humble origin, raised through merit, tempered by war. His reign would bring restoration, not of the Republic, but of order. The year of the 4 emperors had revealed a hard truth, that Rome's stability now depended not on the Senate, nor the laws, but on the discipline of armies and the wisdom of the man who held the purple. And in Vespasian, the empire had found such a man. In 69 CE, as the dust of civil war settled and the smoldering ruins of Rome cooled, a new emperor arrived to restore order, Titus Flavius Vespasianus, Vespasian. He was unlike those who came before him. Not a descendant of Augustus, not born into nobility, Vespasian was the first emperor to rise from the equestrian class. A soldier of grit and realism, he had earned his reputation in Germany, Britain, and most recently, in the brutal campaigns against Jewish rebels in Judea. Where Nero had ruled by vanity, and Vitellius by indulgence, Vespasian ruled by discipline. He brought stability where there had been none. He restored the finances of the empire, depleted by extravagance and war, through new taxes and careful management. He purged the Senate of its more dangerous elements, but welcomed capable men from the provinces into imperial service, a quiet revolution that began to reshape Rome's elite. Most importantly, he gave Rome the gift of peace. The city had suffered deeply from fire, famine, and faction. Vespasian rebuilt the capital, repaired temples, and began work on a grand new structure in the heart of Rome, the Flavian Amphitheatre, known today as the Colosseum. It would stand as a symbol of Rome's resilience and its emperor's legacy. Vespasian's rule was firm but modest. He avoided divine honors, laughed at satire, and once, when told of a bad omen, is said to have replied dryly, "The empire will survive a sneeze." Even his death, in 79 CE, reflected his humor. Feeling the end near, he reportedly quipped, "Ve, puto deus fio, alas, I think I am becoming a god." He was succeeded by his eldest son, Titus, a rare peaceful transfer of power. Titus had won renown as a general, having completed the siege of Jerusalem in 70 CE. His triumph in Rome featured the spoils of the Second Temple, its sacred menorah and treasures paraded through the streets. A grand arch would later commemorate the victory, its reliefs carved in enduring stone. As emperor, Titus reigned only briefly, but with dignity. In 79 CE, mere months into his rule, Mount Vesuvius erupted, burying Pompeii and Herculaneum under ash. Titus responded swiftly, providing aid and overseeing rescue efforts. A year later, Rome was ravaged by fire and plague. Again, Titus acted with generosity. His compassion won him affection, and upon his death in 81 CE, the Senate deified him. His brother, Domitian, now took power, the last of the Flavian line. Domitian's reign was complex. He strengthened the frontier, raised soldier pay, and governed efficiently. But his autocratic style, obsession with loyalty, and brutal purges drew fear. He was addressed as Dominus et Deus, Lord and God, and brooked no dissent. In 96 CE, he was assassinated in a palace plot. With his death, the Flavian dynasty ended. But they had left Rome stronger. Through crisis and change, the Flavians had restored imperial dignity. They had shown that emperors need not be born noble, but must rule with purpose. And they had laid the foundation for what would follow, an age of wise rule and enduring prosperity. For now, from the provinces, a new kind of emperor would rise, one chosen not by blood, but by merit. With the death of Domitian in 96 CE, Rome stood at a turning point. The scars of tyranny were still fresh, but the Senate, determined to restore balance, reached for a new kind of leader, one not born into power, but raised by virtue. They found such a man in Marcus Cocceius Nerva. Nerva was elderly, childless, and respected. His short reign was a bridge between turmoil and reform. Most crucially, he adopted a capable heir, Trajan, setting a precedent that would shape a century of stability. Thus began the era of the five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, and Marcus Aurelius. Their rule, from 96 to 180 CE, marked the pinnacle of the Roman Empire. Trajan, a Spaniard by birth, was a soldier emperor, disciplined, generous, and beloved by the army. He expanded the empire to its greatest territorial extent, conquering Dacia, modern Romania, and bringing vast gold reserves into Roman hands. He also built roads, bridges, public baths, and the Grand Trajan's Forum, with its towering column that told his victories in stone. He was succeeded by Hadrian, another provincial, thoughtful and philosophical. Where Trajan had expanded, Hadrian consolidated. He strengthened borders, withdrew from overextended frontiers, and traveled across the empire, from Britannia to Egypt, inspecting troops and projects. He left behind the mighty Hadrian's Wall in northern Britain, a symbol of Roman might and limits. Hadrian also invested in culture and law. He patronized the arts, rebuilt the Pantheon, and improved legal equity for non-Roman subjects. Yet he could be harsh, brutally suppressing a Jewish revolt in Judea, destroying Jerusalem and refounding it as a Roman city, Aelia Capitolina. Next came Antoninus Pius, whose reign was marked by rare peace. He ruled from 138 to 161 CE, a span of quiet administration and gentle reform. Rome flourished economically and culturally under his even hand. He never left Italy during his rule, a testament to the calm he maintained. But it was his adopted son, Marcus Aurelius, who would carry the legacy forward with solemn grace. Marcus was not only a ruler but a philosopher, a student of Stoicism. His meditations, written in the midst of war, remain among the most profound reflections on duty, fate, and virtue in all antiquity. He ruled during turbulent times, plagues, invasions along the Danube, and internal strain. Yet he never abandoned his sense of justice. Beside him stood his co-emperor, Lucius Verus, for a time, and later, his son, Commodus. And here, the Golden Age began to dim. The five good emperors had shown what Rome could be at its best: expansive, stable, generous, and wise. Their strength lay not in their birth, but in their selection, each choosing a worthy heir, rather than clinging to bloodline. But Marcus, despite his wisdom, broke this chain. He left the throne to his son. And with Commodus, the dream of a noble empire would begin to unravel. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 CE, he left the empire to his son, Lucius Aurelius Commodus. It was a decision that broke the pattern of wise succession that had defined the century before. Commodus was young, headstrong, and ill-suited for the burdens of empire. At first, Rome hoped. The son of a philosopher-emperor raised in splendor might carry forward the legacy of prudence and justice. But from the outset, Commodus showed little interest in governance. He delegated authority to favorites, freedmen, concubines, and corrupt officials, while he indulged in spectacles, luxuries, and games. Commodus fancied himself a new Hercules. He dressed in lion skins, wielded a club, and appeared in the arena not as emperor, but as gladiator, fighting tame opponents before orchestrated crowds. He renamed Rome Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus, and demanded to be worshipped as a living god. While the provinces remained quiet, the Senate seethed. The old dignity of imperial restraint had vanished. Executions, conspiracies, and plots became routine. His inner circle wielded deadly influence, enriching themselves as the empire's foundations were slowly chipped away. In 192 CE, a fire ravaged part of the city, a sign, some whispered, of divine anger. Not long after, a conspiracy formed among members of the court, including his concubine Marcia. That December, Commodus was poisoned, and when the poison failed, strangled in his bath by a wrestler. His death was met not with mourning, but with relief. The Senate rejoiced and declared him a public enemy. Yet once again, Rome faced a crisis of succession. Commodus had no heir. And as in the year following Nero's fall, power passed not by law, but by force. The next year, 193 CE, would be remembered as another year of the 5 emperors. Pertinax, an elderly senator, was proclaimed emperor, but ruled only briefly before being murdered by the Praetorian Guard, who then offered the throne to the highest bidder. Didius Julianus won the auction, purchasing the empire for a price in gold. But the legions in the provinces, disgusted, revolted. 3 commanders declared themselves emperor: Pescennius Niger in Syria, Clodius Albinus in Britain, and Septimius Severus in the Balkans. Of these, it was Severus who acted fastest. He marched on Rome, deposed Julianus, and secured the capital. With brutal efficiency, Severus crushed his rivals and established a new dynasty, the Severans. Yet the message was clear. No longer did law, tradition, or the Senate determine who ruled. It was the army, the legions, that now crowned emperors. The Principate had begun as a delicate mask over monarchy. But that mask was slipping. Rome had become a militarized autocracy, where violence replaced vote, and loyalty was bought not with honor, but with coin. The long, slow decline had begun. In 193 CE, Septimius Severus entered Rome not as a savior of the Senate, but as the commander of the legions. A native of North Africa and a seasoned general, he understood that power in this new age rested not in rhetoric, but in arms. He ruled as a soldier emperor, and Rome would never rule the same again. Severus was decisive, intelligent, and ruthless. He purged the Praetorian Guard, replacing it with men from his own legions. He marginalized the Senate, expanded the military, and raised soldiers' pay, securing their loyalty with gold rather than tradition. His campaigns extended the empire's eastern frontier and fortified the Danube. He even visited Britain, where he fought the Caledonians and strengthened Hadrian's wall. But his governance was rooted in control, not consultation. The empire, once balanced between civic and military spheres, now leaned heavily toward the sword. Roman identity was broadened. Severus promoted provincial elites, elevated his African and Syrian background proudly, and fused diverse peoples into the imperial machine. When he died in 211 CE, he left the empire to his 2 sons, Caracalla and Geta. It was a fatal decision. The brothers despised each other. Rome was divided between their followers. Within a year, Caracalla had his brother murdered, in their mother's arms, and ruled alone. Caracalla is remembered less for governance and more for bloodshed. He massacred Geta's supporters, ruled with paranoia, and lived as a man both feared and hated. Yet he made one lasting mark on Roman history, the Constitutio Antoniniana of 212 CE. With it, he granted Roman citizenship to nearly all free men in the empire. What once had been a privilege of Italians and select provincials now became universal. The Roman identity was no longer tied to city or race, but to allegiance. It was an administrative move, perhaps driven by the desire to broaden the tax base, but it would forever change the empire's social structure. Caracalla was assassinated in 217 CE by a member of his own guard while traveling in the east. In the chaos that followed, Rome fell under the control of a series of short-lived rulers, Macrinus, Elagabalus, and eventually, Alexander Severus. Each faced growing threats, from within and without. The army had tasted its power and would not relinquish it. Provincial governors eyed the throne. The frontiers strained under pressure. Germanic tribes pressed the Rhine. The Sassanids, a resurgent Persian dynasty, challenged Rome in the east. By the mid-3rd century, the empire had begun to fracture. Between 235 and 284 CE, Rome endured what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, a time when emperors rose and fell with terrifying speed. Over 50 men would claim the purple, most died in battle or by assassination. The empire split into rival regions. Plagues ravaged cities. Inflation soared. And the once mighty legions were stretched thin across a crumbling border. The dream of eternal Rome seemed to falter. Yet from this storm, new reforms would arise. The empire would not fall, not yet. It would adapt. It would survive. But the Rome of Augustus, of marble forums and philosophical emperors, had vanished. What remained was a harsher Rome, forged by crisis, ruled by generals, and preparing to become something new. The year was 235 CE. The Emperor Severus Alexander, last of the Severan line, was assassinated by his own troops. They had grown weary of his cautious leadership and peacemaking policies. In his place, they raised a soldier from the ranks, Maximinus Thrax. This moment marked the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century, a half-century of upheaval during which the Roman Empire was nearly lost. From 235 to 284 CE, Rome saw over 50 claimants to the imperial throne. Most were generals, chosen by their legions, often assassinated before their reigns could mature. Civil wars became routine. Power shifted rapidly. The frontiers broke under pressure. The empire was assailed on all sides. In the west, Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube, raiding Roman towns and seizing land. In the east, a new and aggressive power rose, the Sassanid Empire of Persia. Under King Shapur I, the Persians invaded Syria and captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, a humiliation unprecedented in Roman history. Valerian was paraded as a trophy and, some claimed, used as a human footstool before being executed. As central authority crumbled, the empire itself began to fracture. In Gaul, Spain, and Britain, a breakaway regime formed, the Gallic Empire, ruled by its own emperors. In the east, Palmyra, a wealthy desert city under Queen Zenobia, rose to near independence, controlling Egypt and much of the Levant. Each state minted its own coins, raised its own armies, and governed its territories without deference to Rome. The economy faltered. Trade routes were cut. Currency was debased to the point of worthlessness. Cities shrank. Roads deteriorated. Plague, possibly a resurgence of smallpox, further weakened the empire. The myth of Roman invincibility seemed shattered. And yet, Rome endured. From the chaos, a few strong emperors emerged, men not of noble lineage, but of grit and resolve. Among them was Aurelian, who reigned from 270 to 275 CE. He was a commander of exceptional skill, and under his hand, the empire was reconsolidated. Aurelian crushed the Gallic Empire in the west and subdued Queen Zenobia in the east. He was hailed as Restitutor Orbis, restorer of the world. He also began construction on the Aurelian walls around Rome, a sign that even the Eternal City now feared invasion. Though Aurelian was assassinated before completing his reforms, he had proven that the empire could be stitched back together, if only for a time. Others followed. Probus, Tacitus, Carus. Each struggled against rebellion, invasion, and decay. None reigned long. But in 284 CE, the legions declared a new emperor, a man of low birth but immense discipline and vision. His name was Diocletian. And with him, Rome would undergo a transformation, not back to what it had been, but forward into something more rigid, more durable, more imperial in every sense. The crisis had not ended Rome. But it had ended the old Rome. In 284 CE, the army proclaimed Diocletian emperor. He was a man of modest origin, born in Dalmatia, and risen through the military. Unlike those who sought to cloak imperial power in republican forms, Diocletian made no such pretense. He ruled not as a first among equals, but as an absolute monarch. And he understood what few had fully grasped, that the crisis of the 3rd century was not just a failure of men, but of structure. The empire had grown too vast, too complex, too vulnerable to be governed by one man alone. The old model of the Principate, forged by Augustus centuries earlier, could no longer hold. So Diocletian divided power, but not the empire. He created the Tetrarchy, or rule of 4. 2 senior emperors, called Augusti, would govern the eastern and western halves. Each would appoint a junior emperor, a Caesar, to assist and eventually succeed them. This system aimed to ensure smooth succession, regional control, and military responsiveness. Diocletian ruled the east, while his trusted colleague Maximian ruled the west. Their Caesars, Galerius and Constantius, governed key frontiers. Together, they oversaw taxation, defense, and law with renewed efficiency. Under Diocletian, the empire stabilized. He reformed the currency, reorganized the provinces, and expanded the bureaucracy. He introduced uniform tax assessments, based on land and population, to sustain the army. he launched campaigns against external foes, Persians in the east, Germanic tribes in the west, and won. Yet his reign was not without shadows. In 303 CE, Diocletian initiated the last and most severe persecution of Christians in Roman history. Churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and thousands imprisoned or executed. He believed the old gods had been angered by Rome's tolerance, and he sought to restore traditional piety through force. But the Christian faith, far from crushed, endured. And Diocletian, sensing the wear of age, chose a final act of control, abdication. In 305 CE, he and Maximian retired, the first Roman emperors to do so voluntarily. Diocletian withdrew to his palace in modern-day Split, tending to gardens and watching the empire from afar. Yet his system, so carefully crafted, could not withstand the ambition of men. Within a few years, the Tetrarchy broke apart. Rival Caesars declared war. Maximian returned. Sons of emperors claimed power. Civil war ignited once again. But out of this storm, one figure began to rise. His name was Constantine, son of Constantius, heir to the west, and soon, he would seize what even Diocletian had never dared to claim: sole rule over the Roman world. In the aftermath of Diocletian's abdication, the empire again fractured. The Tetrarchy, designed for order, devolved into rivalry. Ambition, inheritance, and loyalty to blood over title undid the careful balance. In the west, Constantius Chlorus, one of the Caesars, died in 306 CE. His son, Constantine, was immediately hailed as emperor by his father's troops in Britain. Rome's old ghost stirred once more. The Senate had no say. The Tetrarchy faltered. Within a few years, no fewer than 6 men claimed the imperial throne, each with armies, titles, and justifications. Among them, Constantine rose steadily. He won the allegiance of key provinces. He secured his rear through marriage alliances and shrewd diplomacy. But his moment of destiny came in 312 CE, at the gates of Rome, at the Milvian Bridge. There he faced Maxentius, one of the rival emperors, who held Rome and claimed legitimacy. According to tradition, on the eve of battle, Constantine had a vision, a cross of light in the sky bearing the words "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign, you will conquer. That night, he ordered his soldiers to place the Christian symbol, the Chi Rho, upon their shields. The next day, Constantine's forces routed Maxentius's army. Maxentius himself drowned in the Tiber. Constantine entered Rome in triumph, not as a tyrant, but as liberator. The age of Christian Rome had begun. The next year, Constantine and his remaining rival, Licinius, issued the Edict of Milan, a decree granting religious tolerance to all faiths, and restoring property to Christians. It marked the end of persecution and the beginning of imperial patronage for Christianity. But unity remained elusive. Between 314 and 324 CE, Constantine fought a series of wars against Licinius. At last, in 324, he defeated him near Byzantium, becoming the sole emperor, the first to rule alone since Diocletian's division. Now undisputed master of the empire, Constantine set about reshaping it. He restructured the military and bureaucracy, separating civil and military command. He reformed the coinage and stabilized the currency with the gold solidus, which would endure for centuries. He promoted men based on merit, not class. But his most lasting legacy lay in two foundations: religion and geography. In faith, Constantine aligned the empire with Christianity. He did not outlaw paganism, but favored the church, building basilicas, granting privileges to clergy, and calling the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE. There, bishops from across the empire debated the nature of Christ, leading to the Nicene Creed, the first unified statement of Christian belief. In geography, he established a new capital, Constantinople, built on the site of Byzantium, at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. It was a city of marble and gold, ringed with walls, destined to outlast Rome itself. In 337 CE, Constantine fell ill. On his deathbed, he was baptized, the first Roman emperor to formally convert to Christianity. He died a Christian, a monarch, and a maker of worlds. His sons would divide the empire again. His successors would struggle. But Constantine's legacy endured: a Christian empire, an Eastern capital, and the unbroken vision of a united Rome under one faith and one ruler. After Constantine's death in 337 CE, his three sons inherited the empire: Constantius II in the east, Constantine II, and Constans in the west. But brotherhood yielded to rivalry. Within a few years, Constantine II and Constans were dead, and Constantius ruled alone. The unity, however, was illusion. The empire, though legally whole, had become functionally divided. The East, with its wealth, cities, and defensible frontiers, flourished. The West, poorer and more exposed, struggled beneath growing pressure. One of the key threats was the Germanic tribes along the Rhine and Danube, particularly the Goths. These peoples, once pushed back by Roman legions, were now being driven westward by a new and terrifying force: the Huns. In 376 CE, thousands of Visigoths, men, women, children, gathered at the Danube, begging for asylum within Roman borders. Emperor Valens, ruling in the east, allowed them to enter. But poor treatment, extortion by Roman officials, and famine pushed the Goths to rebellion. In 378 CE, Valens marched to confront them near Adrianople. The result was catastrophe. The Battle of Adrianople was one of the worst defeats in Roman history. Valens himself was killed, his body never found, and 2/3 of the Roman army was destroyed. The myth of Roman invincibility shattered. The West, meanwhile, struggled under its own burdens. Theodosius I, last ruler of a united empire, tried to restore order. But after his death in 395 CE, the division became permanent. His two sons inherited separate halves: Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. The Western Roman Empire, now centered in Ravenna, was beset by invasions, political infighting, and economic decline. It lacked the resources, leadership, and military strength of the East. In 410 CE, Rome itself, once untouched for 8 centuries, was sacked by the Visigoths under King Alaric. Though the city was spared total destruction, the symbolic blow was immense. Saint Jerome, writing from Bethlehem, lamented, "The city that had taken the whole world was itself taken." Over the next decades, waves of invaders swept across the west, Vandals through Spain into North Africa, Huns into Gaul and Italy, and more Germanic tribes pressing ever deeper. By the mid-5th century, Roman emperors in the west were mere puppets, placed and removed by barbarian generals like Ricimer. In 476 CE, the final act came. Romulus Augustulus, a child emperor in Ravenna, was deposed by Odoacer, a Germanic warlord who sent the imperial insignia to Constantinople and ruled Italy in his own name. The Western Roman Empire had fallen. There was no great final battle, no thunderous collapse. It faded, quietly, into the hands of new rulers. But the East, the Byzantine Empire, endured. From Constantinople, emperors still ruled in Caesar's name. Roman law, language, and culture survived. Christianity flourished. Rome had not died. It had transformed. After 476 CE, while the Western Empire lay in ruins, the Eastern Roman Empire, what we now call the Byzantine Empire, remained intact. Centered in Constantinople, it claimed unbroken succession from Augustus. Its people still called themselves Romaeo, Romans. Here, Latin remained in use for a time, but gradually gave way to Greek. The empire evolved in form, faith, and language, yet retained the soul of Roman order, law, and imperial tradition. The Eastern Empire had key advantages. Its capital, Constantinople, was nearly impregnable, ringed by massive Theodosian walls, defended by the sea on 3 sides, and located at the crossroads of Europe and Asia. Its economy, based on trade, silk, and taxation, remained strong. And its bureaucracy, inherited from Diocletian and Constantine, gave it structure and resilience. The early Byzantine period was marked by both challenge and ambition. In the 6th century, Justinian I rose to the throne. A man of vision and determination, he dreamed of restoring Roman glory. His general, Belisarius, led campaigns that briefly reconquered Italy, North Africa, and parts of Spain. For a fleeting moment, the Mediterranean was once again a Roman lake. Justinian's greatest legacy, however, lay not in war but in law. He commissioned the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, a vast codification of Roman legal tradition that would shape European law for centuries to come. He also adorned his capital with splendor. The Hagia Sophia, a marvel of dome and light, rose under his orders, a church so vast and magnificent that it seemed to defy the heavens. Yet Justinian's reign also bore hardship. Plague struck in the 540s, killing millions. His wars strained the treasury. And after his death, much of the reconquered West was lost again. Still, Byzantium held firm. For centuries, it fended off Persians, Arabs, and Avars. It transformed its military into a flexible, mobile force, the Themes. It forged diplomatic ties, used Greek fire in naval battles, and adapted to changing threats. Religion, too, shaped the empire's identity. Byzantine emperors saw themselves as defenders of orthodoxy. This led to deep theological debates, and eventually, the schism with the Western Church in 1054 CE, splitting Christendom into Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox branches. In time, new powers rose, the Bulgars, the Rus, and most fateful of all, the Seljuk and later Ottoman Turks. Yet for nearly 1,000 years after the fall of the West, the Eastern Empire endured. It would know glory under the Macedonian dynasty, decline after the Fourth Crusade, and a brief restoration under the Palaiologos emperors. But always, it remained Rome, not in form, but in memory, continuity, and spirit. Its final fall, still centuries away, would mark the end of ancient Rome itself. When Justinian I came to the throne in 527 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire was resilient but threatened, pressed by Persian forces, challenged from within, and haunted by the memory of what had been lost in the West. But Justinian did not see himself as a caretaker. He saw himself as a restorer. His reign would become the most ambitious since Constantine. He would aim to reclaim lost lands, unify the empire under Christian doctrine, codify centuries of Roman law, and leave behind a legacy written in marble and flame. At his side stood Theodora, his wife, once an actress and courtesan, now empress and co-ruler. She was sharp, defiant, and unwavering in crisis. During the Nika riots of 532, a violent uprising that burned much of Constantinople, it was Theodora who urged Justinian to stand firm. Royalty is a fine burial shroud, she is said to have declared, and with that, the emperor crushed the revolt and rebuilt stronger. In the aftermath, Justinian's grandest project began, the Hagia Sophia. Its soaring dome, filled with light and gold, symbolized the union of heaven and earth, and the emperor's claim to divine favor. For centuries, it would be the heart of Eastern Christendom, a marvel of architecture and devotion. Justinian also turned to conquest. His general Belisarius, brilliant and loyal, led campaigns to reclaim the West. He defeated the Vandals in North Africa, restored imperial rule in Sicily and Italy, and even entered Rome, long abandoned to the Goths. For a time, it seemed the old empire would be reborn. But reconquest came at a cost. Italy, after years of war, lay devastated. Taxation increased to fund the campaigns. The treasury emptied. And in 541, plague struck, a terrible epidemic, perhaps an early form of bubonic plague, which ravaged the population for decades. Constantinople was decimated. The empire's strength waned. Yet Justinian pressed on. He saw the empire as not merely a political entity, but a divine order, bound by Christian truth. To this end, he suppressed heresies, closed the ancient academy in Athens, and strengthened the Church's authority. He also issued the Corpus Juris Civilis, the definitive collection of Roman law, which clarified and preserved centuries of legal tradition. It would shape not only Byzantium, but the legal systems of Europe long after Rome's fall. When Justinian died in 565 CE, he left behind an empire both exhausted and ennobled. The western provinces he had reclaimed would soon slip away. But the structures he built, in law, religion, and architecture, would endure. His vision of empire as a sacred duty would guide Byzantine rulers for generations. He was, in many ways, the last Roman, the final ruler to dream of Rome as a single, universal state. After him, the empire would survive, but the dream would fade. After Justinian's death in 565 CE, the Eastern Roman Empire faced a harsh reality. The dream of reconquest had passed, and the task now was to hold what remained. The West was lost again, North Africa to the Berbers, Italy to the Lombards, and Spain to the Visigoths. Meanwhile, new threats loomed on every border. To the east, the Sassanid Persians grew bold, launching raids and sieges that reached the very gates of Ansh and Jerusalem. In the north, Slavs and Avars poured into the Balkans, settling and reshaping the region. The empire, stretched thin, began to lose its grip. But the gravest blow came from the south. In the 7th century, a new faith, Islam, emerged in Arabia. Within decades, Muslim armies swept through the ancient heartlands of the Roman East. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa, lands that had been Roman for centuries, were lost. By 717 CE, Arab forces besieged Constantinople itself. But the city held. Behind its massive walls and with the use of Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon, the Byzantines repelled the attackers. The siege was broken, and with it, the advance into Europe stalled. This victory, though often overlooked, was one of the most critical in history. Had Constantinople fallen, Christian Europe may have followed. Even so, the empire had shrunk. To survive, Byzantium adapted. The Latin traditions faded further, replaced by Greek language and Orthodox Christianity. A new military system, the Themes, divided the empire into districts, each with its own local army and governor. This decentralized model proved resilient, allowing the empire to defend itself even in times of crisis. The emperors of this era were not builders of empire, but defenders of its remnants. Among them, Heraclius stood out, the first to fully turn the empire toward a Greek identity. He fought fiercely against Persia, only to see his victories undone by the Arab conquests. Others, like Leo III, repelled further invasions but ignited internal conflict through iconoclasm, the rejection of religious images. Iconoclasm divided the empire. For over a century, emperors alternated between smashing icons and restoring them, leading to unrest and rebellion. The controversy revealed a deeper strain, the tension between imperial authority and the deeply held beliefs of the people and clergy. Still, Byzantium endured. Its cities shrank. Its armies shriveled. But Constantinople remained, a fortress of gold and granite, a beacon of Roman memory in a sea of change. The empire had lost its old form, but not its soul. It would not go quietly into the night. In time, a revival would come, one last breath of glory under a new dynasty. In the 9th century, the empire that had nearly crumbled under siege and heresy began to recover, not by chance, but through steady reform and strong leadership. The turning point came with the rise of the Macedonian dynasty, founded in 867 CE by Basil I. Basil was a man of obscure origin, a peasant from the Macedonian theme, perhaps of Armenian or Slavic descent. Yet through service and cunning, he rose in the court, and after a dramatic palace coup, became emperor. He was no philosopher king, but he brought order, energy, and ambition to the throne. Under Basil and his successors, Byzantium entered a new golden age. The frontiers stabilized. The army, reorganized and professionalized, regained lost ground. The navy secured the seas. And with the threat of Arab expansion slowing, the empire even turned outward once more. Leo VI, Basil's son, was known as the Wise. He revised and codified laws into the basilica, building on Justinian's code for a new Greek-speaking era. He wrote treatises on war, governance, and religion. Though his reign was marred by dynastic trouble, the empire grew more resilient. But it was under Constantine VII and, later, Basil II, that the Macedonian Renaissance reached its height. Constantine VII, though more scholar than warrior, championed learning. He commissioned encyclopedias, manuals for governing, and histories to preserve Roman memory. His court became a center of Greek literature and Orthodox theology. The classical heritage, nearly lost in centuries of war, was reclaimed and recopied. Byzantine art flourished as well. Mosaics shimmered in gold. Icons, once shattered by iconoclasts, now adorn churches again with serene, stylized faces. Architecture revived, with domes and arches echoing the glories of Justinian. But this Renaissance was not only cultural. Basil II, known as the Bulgar Slayer, reigned from 976 to 1025 CE and became one of Byzantium's greatest military emperors. He crushed the Bulgars, reasserted imperial authority in the Balkans, and expanded eastward into Armenia. His discipline was iron, his policies shrewd, and his authority uncontested. By the time of his death, the empire stretched from southern Italy to the Caucasus, from the Danube to the Levant. For the first time in centuries, Byzantium seemed again invincible. Yet even this golden age bore seeds of decline. The wealth of land-owning nobles grew. The themes weakened as military service shifted to mercenaries. And Basil II, though victorious, died without an heir strong enough to hold what he had built. In the century that followed, internal corruption, foreign invasions, and dynastic instability would return. Still, the Macedonian Renaissance had shown that Byzantium, though battered, was still a living empire, proud, sophisticated, and uniquely Roman in its endurance. It had outlasted emperors, heresies, and invasions. But even it would not outlast the coming storm from the west. At the dawn of the 13th century, the Byzantine Empire still stood, diminished from its Macedonian heights, but proud, wealthy, and commanding one of the world's most magnificent cities, Constantinople. But within, it was fragile. Court intrigues, shifting alliances, and rival claimants had weakened imperial authority. The nobles, grown powerful, often placed their interests above the empire's needs. The common people, overtaxed and ignored, looked on in frustration. And in the West, Rome and Constantinople had long since drifted apart. The Great Schism of 1054 had formalized what centuries of divergence had already created: two Christianities, Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox. Though both claimed apostolic tradition, they clashed in language, practice, and above all, in politics. Against this backdrop, the Fourth Crusade was launched in 1202. Its goal, as proclaimed by Pope Innocent III, was to reclaim the Holy Land by striking at Egypt, the center of Muslim power. But the Crusaders, mostly French and Venetian, were poorly funded and deeply indebted, especially to Venice, which had outfitted their fleet. To repay their debt, the Crusaders agreed to a diversion, to attack the Christian city of Zara, a rival to Venice. It was a troubling sign, Christians turning arms on Christians, but the crusade pressed on. Then came a fateful invitation. Alexios Angelos, the son of a deposed Byzantine emperor, approached the Crusaders with an offer: help him reclaim the throne of Constantinople, and he would reward them handsomely, gold, ships, and support for their crusade. The temptation was too great. In 1203, the Crusaders arrived before Constantinople. After a brief siege, they restored Alexios and his blind father, Isaac II, to the throne. But the promised riches never materialized. The treasury was empty. The people despised the puppet emperors and the foreign soldiers now encamped outside their walls. Tension turned to violence. In 1204, after Alexios was murdered in a palace coup, the Crusaders, enraged, unpaid, and eager, launched a second assault. On April 13, 1204, Constantinople fell. The city that had withstood Arab sieges, Slavic raids, and Persian assaults, the city ringed with walls built by emperors of old, was taken by men who bore the cross of Christ. What followed was devastation. Churches were looted, altars desecrated, relics stolen. The Hagia Sophia was plundered. Statues were melted down. Gold and manuscripts, the treasures of 1,000 years, were carried west. It was the worst sack of a Christian city in history. The Byzantine Empire fractured. The Latin Empire of Constantinople was declared, but it never controlled more than the city and its surroundings. In exile, Greek nobles founded successor states, Nicaea, Epirus, and Trebizond. For a time, it seemed the true empire was gone forever. Yet Byzantium, remarkably, endured. In 1261, the Nicaean Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople. The empire was restored, but it was poorer, smaller, and weaker than ever before. The sack of 1204 had not merely wounded Byzantium. It had broken its spirit. By the mid-15th century, the Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self. Gone were the provinces of Syria, Egypt, and Anatolia. Gone were the great imperial estates, the bustling trade networks, the mighty armies of old. What remained was little more than Constantinople itself, surrounded by the encroaching forces of a rising power, the Ottoman Turks. For over a century, the Ottomans had grown stronger, spreading across the Balkans and Asia Minor. Their warriors were fierce, their state disciplined, and their sultans determined. Among them, none would prove more formidable than Mehmed II, a young and brilliant ruler who ascended the throne in 1451. From the start, Mehmed made his goal clear: Constantinople, that city of the world's desire. The emperor in Constantinople, Constantine XI Palaiologos, was brave and steadfast. But he ruled a city with fewer than 8,000 defenders, depleted of gold and cut off from allies. Appeals to the West brought little more than token aid. The schism between Catholic and Orthodox still lingered, deep and painful. In April 1453, Mehmed arrived with over 80,000 men. He brought with him a terrifying new weapon, massive cannon, forged by Hungarian engineer Urban. The largest among them could fire stone balls weighing hundreds of pounds, capable of battering even the mighty Theodosian walls, the ancient bulwark that had protected the city for 1,000 years. The siege began. Day after day, the Ottomans bombarded the walls. They assaulted from land and sea. Greek and Genoese defenders, led by the valiant Giovanni Justiniani, fought with skill and desperation. The city resisted. But the walls cracked. Supplies ran low. And the golden domes of Constantinople trembled under the thunder of gunpowder. On May 29, 1453, after weeks of siege, Mehmed launched his final assault. Wave after wave of Ottoman soldiers stormed the walls. Justiniani was wounded. Morale faltered. Constantine XI, clad in imperial purple, led a final charge into the breach and was never seen again. By dawn, Constantinople had fallen. The Ottomans entered the city. The Hagia Sophia, that jewel of Justinian, was converted into a mosque. Mehmed rode through the streets, declaring the city his capital, and naming himself Caesar-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. The Byzantine Empire was no more. Yet something endured. The heritage of Rome passed into many hands, to the Ottoman sultans, who preserved and transformed its capital, to the Orthodox Church, which continued to sing its liturgies, and to scholars who fled westward, carrying manuscripts that would ignite the Renaissance. Rome had fallen, but not vanished. Its laws shaped Europe. Its faith spanned continents. Its memory became a mirror in which every great power saw itself. And in the stones of Constantinople, in the basilicas and arches of distant lands, in the words of poets and philosophers, the spirit of Rome still breathes. Not as a city, not as an empire, but as a civilization.